Hello friends, welcome to our channel. Today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you, the case of Ekaterina Bauman. Ekaterina Bulgova was born on May 13, 1989 in Leningrad, a city that would later be renamed St. Petersburg. In 2009, Ekaterina, then 20 years old, traveled to Turkey with her family for a vacation. That's where she met Walter Bauman, a German citizen who was 13 years older than her. Walter had received his education in Germany and had a good income, but his personal life was lacking. He was searching for the perfect woman, but he didn't quite fit the criteria of a perfect man. He still lived with his parents, didn't take care of his appearance, and had a sloppy style. He often met women online, and many of them were Russian. Ekaterina and Walter got married in a luxurious ceremony. After the wedding, they moved into Walter's parents' home, which proved to be a challenging experience for Ekaterina. Living with Walter's parents was not easy, and this marked the beginning of problems for Ekaterina after her move to Germany. The fairy tale romance was starting to lose its magic. Walter's mother, Ludmila, was a strong-willed woman who had achieved great success as an immigrant in Germany. However, she struggled to accept that her son Walter was now a grown man in his 30s and no longer needed her guidance. Ekaterina, Walter's wife, tried her best to please Ludmila, but Ludmila continued to interfere in their marriage and criticize Ekaterina. In 2017, Ekaterina became pregnant, and Walter decided to use some of his savings to buy a house, hoping that this new chapter would bring positive change to their relationship. Unfortunately, the move did not have the desired effect, as Ludmila continued to visit frequently and insert herself into their lives. The birth of their daughter brought even more tension to the relationship between Walter and Ekaterina. Walter became increasingly strict and controlling, speaking down to Ekaterina and restricting her freedom. He prohibited her from learning to drive a car and did not allow her to speak with their daughter in German. Ekaterina was confused and unsure of what was causing these changes in Walter's behavior. Walter and Ekaterina's relationship had become strained, and he would physically harm her, including beating her. Authorities were alerted to the domestic violence issue in late 2019, but the case was dismissed when they claimed they had reconciled. Ekaterina expressed concerns about Walter's behavior, citing his lack of interest in her, excessive work habits, and resulting burnout. Feeling constantly stressed and fearful, Ekaterina turned to a support center for domestic violence victims for the first time in fall 2020. When Ekaterina and their daughter left, Walter made an effort to reconcile with them, promising to change and acknowledging his past wrongdoing. He also told Ekaterina that he couldn't live without her and their daughter. Although Ekaterina forgave him and returned home with their daughter, their arguments persisted. When Walter recognized he had wronged Ekaterina, he would try to make amends with gifts or family trips. While this may have indicated a change in attitude towards Ekaterina, Walter's behavior towards their daughter was marked by total control. Walter was a calculated individual who dramatized situations and manipulated others to get what he wanted. He was extremely frugal and prioritized accumulating wealth. Those who knew him well described him as anxious and impatient. After Ekaterina became a mother, she made several trips to Russia with her husband Walter, who was concerned that she would return to Russia and keep him from seeing their daughter. As Ekaterina experienced more and more abuse from Walter, she began to consider divorce. Ekaterina's reason for staying with Walter was to protect her daughter, but she couldn't take her daughter back to Russia because Walter had to give his consent, which he refused to do. In August 2021, Ekaterina took her daughter to a women's crisis center, telling the administration that Walter had threatened to take her life. Social services considered placing a 5-year-old girl in an orphanage, a situation the Youth Affairs Department psychologist deemed severe. Although Ekaterina initially agreed to let the child enter foster care, her husband Walter and his mother objected, forcing the parents to care for their daughter temporarily. The family reunited weeks later, but Walter and Katerina started divorce proceedings and began living separately. Katerina's desire to return to Russia intensified, but Walter consented only if their daughter remained with him in Germany. At the start of 2022, Katerina traveled to St. Petersburg alone, meeting a Russian pilot from Omsk she had met online while there. After returning to Germany in mid-January 2022, Katerina continued to communicate with the pilot daily. Katerina, a 32-year-old woman, stopped contacting her family and her new lover on February 4, 2022, after returning to Germany. This was a surprise to her family, as she had been exchanging love messages with her new lover just a few weeks earlier. According to her husband Walter, Katerina left behind most of her belongings, including her phone, keys, clothes, and her 5-year-old daughter. She took only an empty suitcase and 13,000 euros from her husband's stash. This is the information Walter shared with the police on February 6, 2022, after Katerina's parents reached out to them to request a check because they couldn't reach Katerina for 2 days. Katerina's mother, Svetlana, reported that she learned about her daughter's disappearance in a strange way. She couldn't reach Katerina on the phone for a few days, and when she spoke with Walter, he claimed that he hadn't seen her since February 5th and that she wasn't responding because she didn't have enough money on her phone balance. The police waited 4 days before searching the Walter family's house where Katerina was last seen. By then, Walter had completed his renovations, which included painting the guest room floor and replacing a couch. He had also purchased a large quantity of cleaning supplies from a local store. The police investigation at the Baumann house found that the surveillance footage had mysteriously disappeared. A detection dog was brought in to search the house and garage, but although it seemed agitated, it didn't indicate finding anything specific. Initial tests found no evidence in the house or garage, but a knife and electric shocker were seized from the car. What raised suspicions was Walter's unusual behavior. He showed no concern for his missing wife, but expressed interest in gaining sole guardianship of their 5-year-old daughter. On March 1, 2022, 25 days after her disappearance, the horrific discovery of a suitcase containing human remains that washed up along the River Weser. The person who discovered the suitcase was horrified to find that it contained the fragments of a woman's body, packed in garbage bags. Unfortunately, not all of her body parts were present in the suitcase, as some were still missing. To make matters worse, the fragments were identified as those of 32-year-old Katerina Baumann. Coincidentally, the suitcase was found near the lighthouse where Katerina had previously gotten married. During a thorough search of the Walter family home, investigators found a variety of suspicious items, including a bottle of sedatives that matched the substance found in Katerina's blood. Additional discoveries included disposable gloves, foil, adhesive tapes, garbage bags, and cleaning products, as well as canisters containing acetic acid, solvents, and bleach. Notably, the police found a pink scarf matching the one Katerina wore in her last selfie near her body. They also discovered a set of suitcase keys and other incriminating items in the garage and shed. Furthermore, the investigation revealed that most of Katerina's personal belongings were absent, with her clothes thrown away and her wedding photo hidden behind the piano. One key piece of evidence turned up at the workplace of Ludmila Baumann, Walter's mother. The white jacket Katerina wore in her last selfie was found in a trash container. Katerina's phone was last connected to the network at 7:41 p.m. Later that evening, she made a video call to her new lover from her computer at 8:25 p.m., saying she would call him again after putting her child to bed. However, she never made that call, and her phone remained silent for the rest of the evening. 2 hours after her video call, her lover sent her a goodnight message, which she never read. A forensic examination revealed that Katerina died 2 hours after dinner, based on the analysis of her stomach contents. The examination also found strong sedatives and alcohol in her blood, and her hyoid bone was broken, indicating that she was strangled. The examination further showed that her body was mutilated using very sharp tools. The next morning, Walter briefly opened his car door at 7:22 a.m., and the car was driven off at 10:20 a.m., returning at 4:49 p.m. 3 days later, Walter called Katerina's phone, likely to create the illusion that she had run away. He also sent her messages asking where she was in an attempt to maintain this illusion. Walter and his mother had a habit of chatting intensely through WhatsApp daily, but after February 4th, they suddenly stopped communicating, which was unusual for them. In the middle of February, Walter took his car to auto service and asked an employee to thoroughly clean the interior from top to bottom. This incident was later cited as evidence in a trial that began on August 26, 2022. The prosecutor argued that Walter had planned and executed the murder of his wife, Katerina, by slipping sedatives into her drink and then strangling her while she was asleep. Walter's motive was to avoid losing guardianship and potential financial losses in the event of a divorce. He had taken steps to prepare for Katerina's body disposal. Police found blood in the garage. Traces of her blood were also found on the carpet in the trunk of his car. Walter's phone and computer were seized by the police. He made several suspicious search queries, including how to avoid punishment for taking someone's life, dissolving human flesh with acid, and accessing other people's WhatsApp chats. He also searched for ways to die from sedatives and how to avoid conviction in Germany. Walter made around 500 search queries between December 2021 and February 2022, suggesting he planned the crime. On the day his wife disappeared, he searched for electric shocker twice. Forensic experts found evidence of electrocution on Katerina's body, suggesting Walter used a shocker to check if she was alive. In court, Walter wore his wedding ring and referred to himself as a widower. He remained silent, plugging his ears during testimonies, but showed emotion when his mother was called as a witness, crying and seeking her help with a prayer-like gesture. He had written to her asking for help, and she seemed willing to assist her son. Ludmila Baumann made a shocking statement, claiming she took Katerina's life, not her son. She visited her son's house at night to care for her granddaughter and found Katerina asleep on the couch. After a fight that started when Katerina hit her, Ludmila choked Katerina. She also admitted to performing certain actions with Katerina's body. It's possible Ludmila was motivated by her love for her son and took the blame for him. Despite her self-incrimination, Ludmila left the courtroom a free citizen as the jury and prosecutor's office didn't believe her statement, assuming she was trying to protect her son. Walter remained silent throughout the entire process, but during one of the final hearings, he read from his notes, which spanned 230 sheets of paper, covering his life, his experiences in Kazakhstan, and his love. His main message was that he loved Katerina and their daughter, but her emotional burnout and psychological problems led to frequent quarrels. Although his statement was extensive, he only briefly mentioned the night that changed everything. According to Walter, he was asleep when his mother took the life of his wife and dragged her into the garage. He blamed his mother for the crime, stating that she had betrayed him, used him, and sent him to prison. Addressing the judge, Walter said that his daughter had already lost her mother and should not lose her father as well. The most disturbing aspect of this story is not the gruesome details of the crime, but the fact that it all took place in front of the perpetrator's 5-year-old daughter. The Russian grandmother is currently barred from contacting her granddaughter, who has been placed with a German foster family. The daughter was present at home with her father when the crime occurred, and as a result, she has developed a psychotraumatic condition. She often mutters to herself, gesturing to her head and arms, indicating that she witnessed the traumatic event. According to her mother, Svetlana, the child is now living in a facility for traumatized children under a new name to protect her from the truth about her family. Svetlana is fighting to gain guardianship of her granddaughter, but German authorities are not allowing her to even have phone contact with the child. On May 23, 2023, the verdict was announced in the case of Walter Baumann. Walter received a life sentence, but under German law, he will be eligible for parole after serving 15 years. Ekaterina's ashes were buried in her hometown of St. Petersburg. Today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you, the case of Michelle Davis. Michelle Ann Corner was born on December 15, 1966, in Iowa. By 2008, she was a 41-year-old mother of 3 living in Des Moines. Her divorce from her husband, Randy Davis, was nearly finalized, and she had taken steps towards starting anew. Michelle had moved into her own apartment and obtained a restraining order against Randy. This marked a significant turning point in her life. However, the years leading up to the divorce were tumultuous for the family. Michelle, described as friendly and adventurous, with a passion for motorcycles, she was a respected and authoritative secretary at a trucking company. On September 11, 2008, Michelle having finally escaped the burdens of her troubled marriage. Colleagues noted the change in her demeanor since her separation. Michelle left work around 4:30 p.m., but her newfound freedom was short-lived. Just after she left, 911 operators began receiving calls about an accident on Interstate 235. A Mercury Sable was found upside down, with Michelle, still wearing her seatbelt, unconscious in the driver's seat. Paramedics rushed to the scene, but sadly couldn't save her. Michelle Davis was pronounced dead. After arriving at the scene, the police initially believed that Michelle lost control of her vehicle, resulting in an accident. However, they quickly ruled out this theory the next day. Forensic experts determined that Michelle's death was not caused by injuries sustained during the rollover, but rather by a gunshot wound to the head. The bullet was extracted and sent for analysis in the hopes of identifying the perpetrator. As they waited for the results of the ballistic examination, local authorities took precautions to ensure public safety. They considered the possibility that Michelle was a random victim and that the shooter might strike again. To address concerns, the police increased patrols in the area. Once it was clear that Michelle's death was not an accident, detectives revisited the crime scene to search for clues. Unfortunately, their efforts yielded no results, as they found neither the cartridge case nor any other evidence to aid in the investigation. The police initially thought Michelle was the victim of a car accident, so the traffic services cleared the site, potentially destroying any evidence. Despite this, the detectives remained hopeful that they could still find answers by reviewing traffic camera recordings. These recordings often help solve cases, and this one was no exception. The investigators started studying the recordings from the traffic cameras, focusing on the one closest to the crime scene. They rewound the recording to the time when people started calling 911. After half an hour, they found what they were looking for. The video showed Michelle's car lying upside down, but the footage was of poor quality, resembling a slideshow with separate pictures and intervals between them. Michelle Davis's family was shocked when investigators revealed her death was not an accident. Her father, Michael Lee Corner, was particularly devastated, having lost another daughter, Cheryl Sue, in 1965, at just 1 year old, and now dealing with the loss of a second child. Michelle's family described her life as having changed significantly in recent times. Despite having no financial problems, they suspected that her husband, Randy Davis, might have been involved in her death. Their divorce was almost finalized, and Michelle had filed a restraining order against Randy. This revelation led the investigators to consider Randy as a potential suspect. Meanwhile, another detective spoke with Michelle's colleagues at her workplace and discovered that she had been in a close relationship with a man named Matt Jorgensen, who was also a colleague. This new information added another suspect to the investigation, as the police sought to understand the complex circumstances surrounding Michelle's death. According to Michelle's friend, Michelle and Matt Jorgensen had mutual feelings for each other. However, Since Michelle was going through a divorce from Randy Davis, they kept their relationship private, only sharing it with close friends and colleagues. When investigators spoke with Matt, he openly discussed his relationship with Michelle and provided a detailed account of his whereabouts on the day of her death. He claimed they never had any arguments or fights. The police verified his alibi, and he was subsequently eliminated as a suspect. The ballistic examination revealed that the murder weapon was a .22 caliber rifle, and experts determined that the shot was fired at close range. Given that the crime occurred on the interstate, the police believed the shooter was likely in another vehicle that was driving alongside Michelle's car. This new information led to the emergence of a new suspect in the case. The police received a tip from Michelle's insurance company that her brother Todd was seeking payment, raising suspicions of a life insurance-motivated crime. A detective visited Todd's house to investigate. When the detective started asking Todd about his whereabouts on the day of Michelle's death, Todd realized he was a suspect. He explained that he was in a different part of the city at the time of her death, and that the family was struggling financially. Todd said he had turned to the insurance company because he needed the money to pay for Michelle's funeral. The police verified Todd's alibi and found that he was not in the area where Michelle was killed. This ruled him out as a suspect, but Todd provided information that led the police to investigate another suspect, Josh. Josh was the son of Randy from a previous marriage and was an adult at the time of Michelle's death. A Marine named Josh had recently returned home from the Army when a tragic event occurred. Michelle was fatally wounded in a car incident, and the police considered Josh a suspect due to his military background. As the investigation continued, a woman reported witnessing something on Interstate 235 on the same day and time as the incident. A witness reported seeing a red Ford F-150 pickup truck driven by a white man in a baseball cap who was driving erratically, swerving between lanes, and appeared to be chasing someone. This new information led investigators to re-examine traffic camera footage, focusing on finding a red pickup truck in the area. The footage confirmed the witness's account, showing a red pickup truck following Michelle from her workplace. Although the footage was not clear enough to reveal the driver's face or the truck's license plate, further review of other camera recordings revealed that the truck was consistently following Michelle's route, staying close behind her as she approached the location of her death. This evidence suggested that the perpetrator likely fired the fatal shot from the truck while driving. Detectives investigating Michelle's death had several suspects in mind, and soon discovered that her husband, Randy Davis, owned a red pickup truck. They immediately visited his house, but found only his son, Josh, who was a Marine trained in handling weapons and had access to his father's vehicle. Josh claimed that on the day of Michelle's death, he went shopping with his sister and then spent the evening at home watching TV. However, detectives found Josh's alibi suspicious. According to Josh, the divorce proceedings between Michelle and his father were challenging, partly due to Michelle's demand for half the house's value. Josh also stated that his father arrived home around 5:30 p.m. that day. The conversation with Josh revealed that he might have had a motive for the crime, as he was upset about Michelle trying to take part of his inheritance during the divorce. This led detectives to view Josh as a potential suspect with a possible motive. Meanwhile, the police canvassed shops and gas stations along the route from Michelle's workplace to the crime scene, hoping to find additional surveillance footage. Their efforts paid off when they discovered crucial footage at a store just a few miles from Michelle's workplace. On September 11, 2008, the day Michelle died, a red pickup truck arrived at the store at around 4 p.m. The truck was registered to Randy Davis. The police needed to determine who was driving it that day. Security footage showed the driver getting out of the truck and entering the store, but the poor video quality made it impossible to identify whether it was Josh or Randy. The man disappeared from view for a while, then reappeared. made a purchase, and left the store. It's worth noting that this all happened at 4 p.m., while Michelle left work at 4:30 p.m. The police continued to analyze the footage and found that the pickup truck returned to the store several times over the next 30 minutes, but the driver didn't get out of the truck on these subsequent visits. The truck's final appearance near the store coincided with Michelle leaving work. Despite being unable to identify the suspect, the police tried to contact Randy Davis again. This time, he responded and came to the police station. The investigators informed Randy of his rights and made it clear that he was not under arrest. Randy agreed to cooperate and answer some questions. When asked about his activities on September 11th, Randy mentioned that he was going through a difficult divorce with his wife Michelle, with whom he had been married for 17 years. Randy claimed to have worked as a carpenter and was at work on the day of the incident. When questioned about his return time, Randy initially hesitated before stating that he arrived home at 3:45 p.m. However, this statement contradicted the surveillance footage and Josh's testimony, which indicated that Randy arrived home around 5:30 p.m. Randy further stated that he didn't leave his home after 3:45 p.m. and was home alone until Josh joined him to cook dinner together. However, this information conflicted with Josh's testimony, which stated that he was already home when Randy arrived. The alibis of Randy and Josh were intertwined, and investigators realized that one of them was not telling the truth. To test Randy's reaction, investigators informed him that Michelle had died from a bullet wound, not from injuries sustained in a car crash. Randy showed little reaction to this news, pretending to be surprised and lowering his eyes. When investigators asked him when he last saw Michelle, Randy requested a lawyer, which ended the conversation. The investigation was lacking in crucial evidence, including the weapon used to take Michelle's life, so Randy Davis was released. On September 15, 2008, Michelle's family and friends gathered to pay their respects at her funeral. Randy Davis attended the ceremony, putting on a show of grief, including bursting into tears. The investigators were working hard to find the answer. Unexpectedly, Josh Davis, Randy's son, walked into the police station with his lawyer and offered to make a statement. According to Josh, his father's car was parked in the driveway when he returned home from his sister. On September 11, 2008, Randy Davis committed a horrific act of violence. His wife, Michelle, had filed for divorce and was seeking part of the property in the divorce proceedings. Randy was unable to accept this and decided to take drastic measures. According to his son Josh, Randy had been planning this act of violence and had even told Josh that he was going to do something that would make Michelle regret it. Josh tried to stop his father, but Randy was determined to carry out his plan. Randy parked his red pickup truck outside the store where Michelle worked and waited for her to leave. He drove past the store several times, making sure not to miss the moment. When Michelle left work, Randy followed her and eventually found the right moment to strike. He rolled down the passenger side window and fired, shooting Michelle. Josh's testimony was crucial in the investigation, and the police were able to arrest Randy Davis based on the information he provided. The incident was also captured on the store's CCTV footage, which showed Randy's truck parked outside the store several times before the shooting. Randy Davis was initially charged with first-degree charges for the death of Michelle, but he made a deal to plead guilty to second-degree deprivation of life in exchange for a reduced sentence. As a result, Davis was sentenced to 50 years in prison in 2010. Today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you, the case of Kira Steger. Kira Steger was born on November 19, 1982, in Des Plaines, Illinois, to parents Marcy and Jay Steger. They remembered her as a vibrant, dedicated, and kind-hearted person. At the time of her disappearance, Kira worked at 2 stores in the Mall of America, Wet Seal and Delia's. Her co-workers were not only close friends but also like family to her. Kira had a remarkable ability to recognize people's hidden strengths and had a promising future ahead of her. However, her life took a tragic turn when she mysteriously vanished on February 21, 2013. On the day she disappeared, Kira had a shift at work and was looking forward to a dinner date with her husband, Jeffrey Trevino, at a nice restaurant after her shift ended. Kira and Jeffrey had met 3 years prior and quickly fell in love, eventually getting married. To those around them, they appeared to be a happy and stable couple, with only occasional disagreements that they kept private. Neither their relatives, friends, nor co-workers were aware of any significant issues in their relationship. On Saturday, February 23rd, Kira's co-workers became concerned when she failed to show up to work. She was known for being punctual, strict, and adhering to her schedule. When they couldn't reach Kira, they called her husband Jeffrey. According to Jeffrey, Kira had left their house the previous morning and hadn't returned. While this wasn't entirely unusual, as Kira would occasionally spend the night at a friend's or relative's house without warning, the severe snowstorm that day was a cause for concern. Jeffrey speculated that Kira's car might have gotten stuck, and her phone battery could have died, leaving her unable to communicate. Jeffrey filed a missing persons report for his wife Kira after not hearing from her, and he also contacted her family to inform them of her disappearance. Her family was shocked and deeply disturbed by the news. Upon receiving the report, detectives launched an investigation into Kira's disappearance. As is standard procedure, they began by questioning Jeffrey and searching the surrounding area. Detectives visited Jeffrey at his home to ask him about Kira's disappearance. He told them that on the previous Thursday, he and Kira had spent time together, having dinner, talking, bowling, and then leaving the mall. According to Jeffrey, they went straight home after that, where Kira planned to watch a movie. Jeffrey also reported that Kira left their house the following Friday morning around 8:30 a.m. to attend a mandatory work event. He stated that Kira was acting normally and didn't appear to be behaving strangely before she left. Jeffrey wasn't concerned about Kira's frequent disappearances, despite not knowing her whereabouts. They had minor relationship issues, but Jeffrey didn't consider them serious. When questioned, he dismissed the possibility of Kira having a lover, citing a previous conversation where she denied it. Jeffrey claimed to trust and love his wife. Investigators relayed information to patrol units and visited the Mall of America to verify Jeffrey's testimony. The Mall of America in Bloomington is one of the largest shopping malls in the world. As such, the mall is equipped with multiple security cameras. Detectives investigated Kira's disappearance by reviewing the footage from the time she left work on February 21st. The footage showed nothing unusual. Jeffrey's account was confirmed, as the footage showed that he met Kira after work, and they spent time together at the mall before leaving. There were no signs of arguments or trouble. Kira's family was struggling with her disappearance, and their anxiety grew as the days passed. They decided to take action and travel to Bloomington to help with the investigation. They created flyers with her picture and posted them around town, hoping to attract attention to the search. The investigators questioned neighbors and obtained footage from a security camera that partially captured Kira and Jeffrey's home. Kira's cell phone records also became available, revealing a significant new lead. A man named Ryan Wendt, a manager at a store where Kira worked, with whom she had a long-term and intense relationship. Police investigated Ryan after learning he'd traveled out of state during Kira's disappearance, raising suspicions due to his past romantic relationship with her and their concurrent out-of-state moves. Detectives sought to determine whether his actions were coincidental or incriminating. The detectives managed to locate Ryan in Colorado and asked him to answer questions. During the questioning, Ryan stated that he had last been in contact with Kira via text messages while driving through South Dakota. He said these messages were sent shortly before Kira disappeared. The police analyzed the timing of these messages and discovered that Kira had been texting with Ryan while she was having dinner with Jeffrey. It was clear that Kira was distancing herself from Jeffrey. The investigators examined Ryan's phone and credit card records to verify his location. Their analysis indicated that Ryan was indeed out of state that evening and had no connection to Kira's disappearance. Based on this information, Ryan was eliminated as a suspect. Further analysis of the messages revealed that Kira had been texting with Ryan even after she returned home with Jeffrey. However, her phone activity ceased at 11:44 p.m., and she has not been active since. A team of investigators reviewed video footage from a surveillance camera at Kira's neighbor's house. The camera's rapid movement made it difficult to observe, but it did capture Jeffrey and Kira's house for a few seconds. According to Jeffrey, they returned home after dinner and bowling, watched a movie, and went to bed. However, the footage showed Kira's car backing into the yard at 2 a.m. and driving away, despite the poor video quality and constant motion. Jeffrey claimed he drove to the gas station to fill up Kira's car, as she had asked him to do before her commute the next day. His alibi checked out, as he was indeed seen at the gas station around 3:30 a.m. However, after leaving the gas station, he didn't return home. Instead, he headed towards the highway, but his exact destination is unknown. Although a neighbor's camera didn't capture him returning home, it's possible he may have arrived when the camera was facing a different direction. Kira's Chevrolet was seen leaving her residence at 9:21 a.m., but the driver's identity couldn't be determined. A missing person report was filed on February 23rd. On February 25th, police received a call about a suspicious vehicle near Kira's workplace. The vehicle had been parked in a multi-story parking lot for several days and was found with suspicious red smudges on the trunk lid. Kira's white Chevy was found with signs of a tragic event, including a few small bloodstains. Her purse, containing divorce court forms, was recovered from the vehicle. A rolled-up trunk mat with dark stains, later confirmed to be her blood, was discovered behind the car. The car left the house at 9:21 a.m. and was captured on camera at the mall 20 minutes later. Unfortunately, there was no camera in the parking lot where the car was eventually found, but there was a camera that captured footage of the path leading to the car. After reviewing the footage, detectives noticed a man wearing a hoodie, which was not unusual given the cold weather, walking after the car had entered the parking lot. The man crossed the street and approached a taxi stand, where he had a brief conversation with a driver before getting into the car and driving off. The police were able to identify the taxi company and determine which car the man had ridden in by tracking the time of the interaction. Since the cabs were equipped with GPS tracking devices, the police were able to determine that the man ended his trip a block away from Kira and Jeffrey's house and paid for the ride in cash before getting out of the car. As the cab drove away from the neighborhood, it was caught on camera by the same surveillance camera that had partially captured Kira and Jeffrey's residence. 2 minutes later, a man wearing a hoodie with a distinctive white logo entered the camera's frame. Although the poor video quality made it hard to discern his face, investigators suspected that the man was likely Jeffrey, given that Kira was missing and the man with the hooded sweatshirt was seen entering Kira and Jeffrey's house. Law enforcement officers executed a search warrant and visited the house, finding numerous dark red stains in the bedroom, including nearly 100 on the mattress. After rearranging and cleaning the room, investigators used luminol to reveal additional stains on the carpet that were not visible to the naked eye. The stains, which originated in the bedroom, were confirmed to be Kira's blood, leading investigators to believe she was likely no longer alive. A search of Jeffrey's car found no blood or signs of a struggle, but a gas station receipt indicated a purchase was made with his card 1 hour and 40 minutes before Kira's car was abandoned. Detectives went to the gas station to review the security footage. The footage showed Jeffrey filling up his car and then going inside to withdraw cash from an ATM. This gave them a clear view of Jeffrey's face and revealed a logo on his jacket that matched the one seen on the man in the earlier footage. Based on this new evidence and the evidence found at the house, 39-year-old Jeffrey Trevino was arrested. He was taken to the police station for questioning and became the main suspect. Jeffrey contacted his attorney during the interrogation and was advised to remain silent. The police had enough evidence to charge him, but needed to find Kira's body to prove his guilt. After months of searching by the police, Kira's family and volunteers, a suspicious bag was found by the side of the road at Keller Lake, near Trevino's house, as the snow began to melt in late March. A bag containing a bloodied pillow, shirt, and bra was discovered, and forensic analysis revealed that the items had Kira's DNA on them. Although the search of the lake was hindered by the presence of ice, divers searched the water body, but unfortunately, no remains were found. The area around the lake was also thoroughly searched using 4 trained search dogs, but these efforts were unsuccessful. 2.5 months after Kira's disappearance, a disturbing call on May 8, 2013, led police to a body in the Mississippi River. Body was identified through dental records as Kira Steger, with severe blunt force trauma and a fractured index finger, making her exact cause of death impossible to determine due to decomposition. To uncover the truth, investigators worked to rebuild the sequence of events surrounding Kira's death. Their theory was as follows. When Kira and Jeffrey arrived home, he discovered that she was texting someone else, which made him suspicious. Kira refused to let him see the messages, leading Jeffrey to violently take her phone and break her finger in the process. Upon reading the romantic messages, Jeffrey's anger intensified, ultimately driving him to kill Kira. After committing the crime, he attempted to erase any evidence of his wrongdoing. Jeffrey used Kira's car to transport her body to a house, where he put it in the trunk. He then stopped at a gas station before driving to a river, where he disposed of the body. On his way back home, he threw away a bag containing Kira's pillow and clothes. The next day, he went to a gas station to withdraw cash from an ATM, knowing he would need it to pay for a taxi, after abandoning Kira's car in a mall parking lot. After getting rid of the car, Jeffrey returned home and spent the rest of the day cleaning the house. Jeffrey's goal was to make it seem like Kira had driven away from her car on her own that morning and was unharmed. However, surveillance footage foiled his plan. In October 2013, a jury found Jeffrey Trevino guilty, agreeing that his actions were not planned in advance, but rather the result of a heated argument that escalated into violence after he discovered Kira's infidelity. Jeffrey Trevino was sentenced to 27.5 years in prison in November 2013. He will be eligible for parole in 2031. Today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you. The case of Mitzi Sanchez. Mitzi Sanchez was born on August 10, 1992, in Vallejo, California. She grew up in a large, close-knit family with 2 brothers and a sister. Mitzi was a cheerful and bright child who enjoyed spending time outdoors with her friends and playing with her siblings from a young age. When she started elementary school, Mitzi was quite independent. Her parents allowed her to walk to school with her brother without any adult supervision, as the school was located just a short distance from their home, with most of the route lying along a busy road. On August 10, 2000, Mitzi's 8th birthday, she was excited about the celebration party her family had been preparing. She asked her mother if she could skip school for the occasion, but her mother said no. Mitzi was upset about it, and around 7:30 a.m., she left her home with her brother. Mitzi was supposed to wait for her brother so they could walk home together, but when her brother went outside the school, he couldn't find his sister anywhere. Thinking she had already left without him, he headed home alone, but it turned out that Mitzi was not there. Their older sister, who was home at that time, immediately became worried, since Mitzi was eagerly anticipating her birthday party, and her absence seemed odd. She waited for some time, hoping that Mitzi would eventually show up, and around 4 p.m., she decided to call their mom and tell her about it. Mitzi's mother called her school and confirmed she attended all her classes. After contacting family and friends with no luck, Mitzi's relatives grew concerned and began searching for her. Family, friends, neighbors, and others joined in, organizing a large search effort. Some walked the streets, while others knocked on doors along the route from school to home. Flyers with Mitzi's information were also printed and distributed. Despite all their efforts, they couldn't find her, so Mitzi's parents decided to call 911. The police immediately joined the search, and local media started covering the case on the same day of Mitzi's disappearance. In recent years, similar incidents had already occurred in their town, where an unknown perpetrator or multiple perpetrators had been kidnapping kids in Vallejo. The most recent case had occurred in December 1999, less than a year before Mitzi's disappearance, when 7-year-old Shiana Fairchild, who lived just a few miles from Mitzi's house, disappeared on her way to school. Despite all the efforts by the police and the FBI, she was never found. Now, when Mitzi vanished on her way home from school, investigators feared the same perpetrator might be involved. Despite the lack of leads at that point, the striking similarities between those cases were already obvious. However, Xana's case remained unsolved, leaving detectives with little to go on. They began re-examining everyone previously considered a suspect in her case, but it yielded no results. The next day, Mitzi's disappearance made headlines not only in the local news, but statewide. Everyone feared a serial kidnapper was at large and dreaded the possibility of him getting away with it once again. Mitzi's relatives gave multiple interviews, trying to draw more attention to the case, and her mom also pleaded with the possible abductor to return her daughter safely. The police received many testimony, but none were helpful. However, everything changed a day after Mitzi went missing when something surprising occurred. A man contacted the police, saying he found bloody rags at a garbage dump. Experts confirmed the rags were bed sheets from a Vallejo hotel. They sent the evidence for blood analysis, which would take days. Investigators went to the hotel but couldn't confirm if Mitzi had been there. While waiting for lab results, investigators searched the landfill for more clues but found nothing. The following day, August 12th, the police received another call, and it changed the course of this case. Immediately at around 11 a.m., a man reported driving through an industrial area in Santa Clara when a little girl ran up to his van, screaming that someone was chasing her. She climbed into the van's cabin, and the driver saw a man running in their direction. The girl yelled that he had kidnapped her and wanted to kill her. As soon as she was in the van, the perpetrator turned around, got into his car, and fled. Meanwhile, the girl told the driver her name was Mitzi Sanchez, and he contacted the police. Officers immediately picked her up and drove her to a hospital for examination. They also called her mother and let her speak to her daughter. Soon after, her relatives rushed to the hospital and reunited with Mitzi. Meanwhile, detectives talked to the van driver. The man provided an important lead as he remembered the license plate of the kidnapper's vehicle because it drove off right in front of his van. It was revealed that the van driver was on that road almost by coincidence. He had a day off, but was asked by his supervisor to cover a shift and deliver a load. If he hadn't been there, the suspect might have caught up with Mitzi. The police ran the license plate and identified the car belonging to a 39-year-old man named Curtis Dean Anderson. He had been on law enforcement's radar before, with prior convictions for thefts, kidnapping, and suspicion of other crimes. Investigators were focused on finding the abductor, while their colleagues were getting ready to listen to Mitzi's story. She recounted how on August 10th, after school, she was excited to go home and celebrate her birthday with her family. When her last class ended, Mitzi chose to go home alone without waiting for her brother. Not far from school, she saw a car parked on the side of the road. A man inside was observing her closely in the rearview mirror. Mitzi felt uneasy but dismissed it quickly, thinking it was daytime. She was on a familiar street, and being young, she didn't fully understand the potential danger from strangers. As Mitzi approached the car, the man got out and asked her to help him. He said he needed to grab a roll of tape from under the car seat, explaining that he couldn't bend down himself due to a leg injury from falling off his bike. Despite her uneasy feeling, Mitzi agreed to help. At that time, she couldn't fully comprehend the potential danger posed by the adult man, and her parents had always taught her to help others. As soon as Mitzi reached for the tape, the perpetrator shoved her inside, covered her mouth with his hand, and slammed the door shut. Mitzi tried to scream, but it was too late. The kidnapper drove off in an unknown direction, leaving her to gaze out the window in horror. At one point, they passed Mitzi's home, and she saw her relatives preparing to celebrate her birthday. A few minutes later, the kidnapper pulled into a deserted parking lot. He gave Mitzi new clothes, forced her to change, and discarded her old clothing in a nearby trash bin. He also warned Mitzi not to try to escape, claiming he had a gun and that no one ever managed to get away from him. In the next few hours, he drove Mitzi in an unknown direction. At one point, she asked why he had kidnapped her, and the man simply replied that the same had happened to him when he was a child. When it got dark, he parked again and began covering the car windows with some rags. He then pulled out a chain and secured it to Mitzi's leg with a padlock. The perpetrator then took out a bottle of alcohol and forced her to take a few sips. Mitzi tried to argue with him, but eventually complied with his demand. After that, the man grabbed a camera and took several pictures of Mitzi, then laid down to sleep right in the car. Mitzi tried to keep her eyes open, afraid of falling asleep. She was thinking how to escape, and at one point saw a police car drive past the parking lot, but it was far away, and even if Mitzi had screamed, the officers would never have been able to hear her. The next day, the perpetrator continued driving her around the city. He made her sit on the floor of the car and covered her with sheets to hide her from view. At one point, he stopped and got out for a few minutes. Mitzi tried to free her leg from the chain, but quickly realized it was impossible. She also found a nail file and attempted to unlock the padlock, but it didn't work. When the perpetrator returned to the car and drove away, Mitzi remained trapped. He claimed he had stopped by her parents' house. The kidnapper pretended to be a concerned citizen and asked for flyers to distribute around town. Mitzi was shocked and overwhelmed. She had been so close to home, yet still remained in captivity. Mitzi quickly understood that she needed to unlock the padlock on her chain. She was scared of what the perpetrator might do if she didn't, but she overcame her fear. She took the bunch of keys, chose one that looked like it would work best, and tried to unlock it. She was surprised when it actually worked. Mitzi then freed herself from the chain, with only the car door left standing between her and freedom. Mitzi opened the window and tried to climb out through it, but she encountered another problem. She was so exhausted that she could barely move her legs. Gathering all her strength, she managed to lift herself and leap out of the car. As she crawled around it, she spotted her kidnapper, who immediately noticed her. The man began shouting for her to come back, but Mitzi had no intention of giving up. With her last ounce of energy, she ran in the opposite direction. The perpetrator chased after her, and Mitzi tried to flag down passing cars for help. She waved and screamed, but they all drove past. Despite this, Mitzi kept moving toward her freedom. She had no doubt that if she stopped for even a second, the perpetrator would catch up and harm her. Everything happened very quickly, but for Mitzi, this moment stretched on forever. Eventually, she spotted a van, ran towards it, and jumped right in front of it. The driver quickly stopped, and Mitzi climbed into the cabin. She was shocked, dehydrated, and hungry, but her life was no longer in danger. At the hospital, doctors provided her with the necessary assistance, and soon her entire family arrived to reunite with her. Mitzi's miraculous rescue instantly became the main news story in the city. When she was brought home, thousands of people gathered on her street, applauding her and shouting birthday greetings, which she had missed. Meanwhile, the police were hunting down the kidnapper, whose whereabouts remained unknown. When they showed his photo to Mitzi's mother, she realized she had actually seen him twice. The first time was before her daughter's abduction, when he stood on their street and looked towards their house. The second time was the day after Mitzi's disappearance, when the perpetrator came to her home and asked for flyers. The search for Curtis continued until late evening. Police set up surveillance at all known places he frequented, and eventually it paid off. He came to a trailer park and was apprehended without resistance. Curtis was booked in jail, awaiting trial, and detectives began investigating his possible connections to other crimes. The man himself told Mitzi she wasn't his first victim, and no one had managed to escape him. Investigators could not believe that this was the suspect's first time committing a crime like this. His actions were calculated and indicated that he had experience in such atrocities. Curtis had a history of kidnapping a woman in 1991 and had been released from prison in 1999. Police were certain that he had killed 7-year-old Gianna Fairchild after his release. There was also no doubt that he intended to kill Mitzi. Moreover, one specific fact directly indicated that it was supposed to happen on the day of her escape. Police learned that Curtis had stopped in the industrial area he used to work in, and that day he visited his former colleagues. He had asked them for a large bag, and detectives immediately realized he planned to dispose of a body in it. After Curtis's arrest, Mitzi struggled to recover for a long time. However, she soon learned that the police were suspecting him of kidnapping Zana, which made her even more uneasy. While Mitzi was glad she managed to escape, she knew the ordeal was far from over. She also worried about the fate of this 7-year-old girl. More than 8 months have passed since her disappearance, and there was no news about Zana's fate. Mitzi wanted to help find her, so just days after her own rescue, she participated in a search operation along with other volunteers. Unfortunately, they couldn't find any new leads on Zana's possible whereabouts. This continued until January 2001, when a human skull was found in the mountains near the city of Santa Cruz. Forensic analysis showed it belonged to Zana, and she was officially declared dead. Mitzi took this news very hard, but ahead of her was another challenge: the trial. It began in April of the same year. Mitzi had to testify before the full courtroom and recount in every detail what Curtis had done to her. He was also present there, but despite all of this, Mitzi managed to fulfill her task in the end. Curtis was sentenced to 251 years in prison, but that wasn't the end of his story. Detectives visited Curtis in jail multiple times and questioned him about possible involvement in other crimes. He confessed to a fellow inmate about kidnapping and killing 8 other girls. The inmate agreed to work with the police and shared Curtis's words in detail. Curtis didn't deny anything but tried to negotiate for privileges, speaking cryptically with detectives. Eventually, he hinted that he had indeed murdered Gianna Fairchild and at least 13 other girls and women. In 2005, he finally fully confessed to Gianna's murder, resulting in an additional 50-year sentence. As for Mitzi, her challenges didn't end with Curtis's trial. Just a few weeks after her rescue, she returned to school, where she faced bullying from other children. They called her the kidnapped girl, said she should have died instead of being saved, and generally behaved extremely inappropriately. As a result, her school years became a heavy burden for her, and along with the tragedy she had experienced, it didn't help in her recovery process. Mitzi also repeatedly joined the searches for other missing children, but more often than not, it ended with the discovery of their bodies. Each time, she felt this tragedy as if it were her own, and ultimately, she couldn't cope with this pressure anymore. Alcohol became her only way to cope with the stress, and with each passing day, Mitzi turned to it more and more frequently. Eventually, she stopped seeing even the slightest chance of returning to a normal life. But one day, everything changed. Mitzi was involved in a serious car accident after a party with friends. She broke her neck and arm and spent 2 weeks in a coma. When she woke up, doctors informed her that she is pregnant and would have a daughter. This news turned her life upside down, and Mitzi found the strength to change it for the better once again. She decided to dedicate all her time not only to her daughter, but but also to other children who became victims of various crimes. She founded a non-profit organization that continues to provide assistance to those in need to this day. As for Curtis, he died of illness in 2007, just 6 years after being sentenced. The only reason the detectives regretted it was the fact that they had not managed to obtain full confessions from him regarding other cases he was suspected of, although they still haven't been solved. The police continue to consider his involvement highly probable. It is worth mentioning that Curtis had a son who followed in his father's footsteps. He was convicted of murder, and in 2019, his own life ended in prison. Today, we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you, the case of Debbie Lynn Randall. Debbie Lynn Randall was born on August 21, 1962, in Marietta, Georgia. She grew up in a loving family with 2 older brothers. After Debbie's birth, her parents divorced, but her dad stayed involved in their lives. Later, their mom married Roy, who became Debbie's stepfather. They lived in a small apartment near a military base in a quiet neighborhood. Debbie was a happy child who enjoyed spending time with friends, playing basketball, and collecting dolls. On January 13, 1972, when Debbie was 9 years old, she had dinner with her family. After that, her mom decided to send her to the laundromat, as she had done many times before. Debbie was supposed to keep an eye on the laundry while it washed, while someone else from the family would help her carry the clothes to the laundromat and back home. The laundromat was just a few hundred yards away from their home, right across the street, so her mom wasn't too worried about anything happening to her. Back then, it was quite common for parents to have their kids help with chores like laundry, and Debbie even made some friends with the other girls at the laundromat. That day, Debbie's mom initially planned for her older brother to go with her, but he was sick and preferred to stay home to watch his favorite TV show instead. So, the mother requested her husband to accompany Debbie to take the laundry. Debbie went along with her stepdad, taking a box of detergent on the way. Her stepdad dropped off the laundry, put it into 2 washing machines, and then left. Debbie stayed behind to wait for the washing to be done. After that, she was supposed to walk home and ask someone to collect the clean clothes because she couldn't carry them all alone. Sometime later, Debbie's mom noticed that she still hadn't returned, even though the laundry should have been done by then. It was getting dark outside, so she and her husband decided to walk to the laundromat, but Debbie wasn't there. The employee told them that she had left a while ago and hadn't come back since. Her mom became worried and started to walk around the nearby streets with Roy, searching for Debbie. Soon, they noticed something strange. A few dozen yards from the laundromat, in the parking lot next to one of the cars, there was spilled detergent. Since Debbie was carrying the box of detergent, her mom immediately thought it might have belonged to her. They continued to search the parking lot and the surrounding area, but there were no other signs of Debbie. Some neighbors, who knew the family well, also joined in to help with the search, but all their efforts yielded no results, and Debbie's mom decided to contact the police. The officers examined the area of the parking lot where the detergent was spilled and noticed their first potential lid. The detergent was scattered just inches away from a parked car, and on its door, they spotted several clear fingerprints. The fresh prints were found lower than the handle, which raised suspicion. The officers believed an unknown person may have grabbed the girl at that spot and touched the car. They took the prints for analysis and started looking for the owner of the vehicle to verify if the prints were theirs. With no other leads, the police started combing the streets, trying to find new clues or witnesses. The laundromat employee mentioned that she hadn't noticed anything suspicious. Debbie had been sitting and waiting for the laundry to finish, then took her box of detergent and left the building. Most likely, she headed home to ask someone to pick up the clothes. The police soon found the first witness, whose account immediately changed the course of the investigation. 12-year-old Sandra, along with her friend, was walking to the same laundromat, helping her carry dirty clothes. Suddenly, they saw a man grabbing a girl in the middle of the street and pulling her into his car parked nearby the laundromat. The girl was screaming and trying to break free, but he slammed the door shut, got behind the wheel, and drove off. The man nearly hit Sandra and her friend, one of whom started shouting after him, but he sped away. At the time, Sandra didn't realize she had witnessed an abduction. She thought the man was the girl's father or some other relative picking her up while she wanted to stay out longer. Because of this, Sandra didn't tell any adults about what happened or report it to the police. When she learned about Debbie's abduction, she provided investigators with crucial information. Based on her description, the perpetrator drove a dark pickup truck, likely a 1957 model. She described the man as young, white, with thick dark hair. He wore a white t-shirt, jeans, and black work boots. Another girl who lived in the same building as Debbie also shared her observations that evening. She was standing outside her apartment when a dark pickup truck drove past the building. At first, she thought it was her uncle behind the wheel, but when the driver stopped right in front of her and looked at the girl, she realized it wasn't him. According to her description, it was a white man with medium-length dark hair. She also provided investigators with a few more details about his appearance that she could remember. The girl mentioned that this man parked near their building, next to the same car where the spilled detergent would later be found. The police soon found another witness. A man who lived near Debbie's house was driving to the hospital to visit his wife. At one point, a dark pickup truck, likely a Dodge, nearly crashed into him before driving off recklessly. The driver appeared to be around 30 years old with dark hair. However, the most crucial detail was that the witness also saw a girl in his car, seemingly attempting to escape while the driver held her with one hand. After hearing all the stories, the police were certain that Debbie had been kidnapped. They shared details about the suspect's car with all patrol units, and police sketch artists drew an image based on what 3 witnesses described. Some officers looked for similar vehicles and questioned their owners, while others led extensive searches for Debbie. As time went on, more volunteers and police officers from different towns joined the efforts. Altogether, about 4,000 people participated in the search, a record for both the city and the entire state. Detectives also investigated various people who knew Debbie, including all male neighbors, her stepfather, and her biological father, but all of them were ruled out as suspects. Her father, who lived in the same city, learned about his daughter's disappearance at work and immediately joined the search efforts. Detectives checked previously convicted criminals living within a few-mile radius of Debbie's home, but they didn't find any suitable suspects among them. The search for Debbie Randall lasted over 2 weeks, but found no results. On January 29th, some students joined the search and went to explore the wooded area near her house. During their search, they noticed tracks leading into the forest, as if something had been dragged. Following the tracks, they found a body and contacted the authorities. They had found Debbie Randall. She was dressed in the same outfit her mother had mentioned on the day she was taken, a lavender dress, dark blue zip-up jacket with a hood, and socks. Her lavender shoes, a recent Christmas gift that she adored, were missing. Medical professionals confirmed she had been strangled to death and had also been sexually attacked. Experts found a single dark hair on her body, most likely belonging to the killer. Since DNA analysis was not used at that time, experts couldn't do much with this evidence. They examined it under a microscope and, based on their knowledge at the time, concluded that it belonged to a man aged between 18 and 30 years old. Debbie's clothing was also covered in dirt. Lacking other leads, detectives decided to examine it more thoroughly. They contacted a geologist and asked him to work with their forensic team together. The detectives determined that some of the dirt consisted of a particular type of clay, mined less than 10 miles from their city. The geologists confirmed that it was indeed the unique northern Georgia clay that couldn't be found anywhere else nearby. There were also other dirt stains different from the first. They were traced back to another type of clay mined by a local company just 2 miles from where the body was discovered. Based on this information, detectives theorized that the perpetrator didn't kill the victim immediately. Instead, he drove her to remote areas where those types of clay were located. Most likely, he initially took her out of town where he sexually assaulted her. Then, he drove to the location where the second type of clay was mined, killed her, and took her to the forest, dragging her body behind the trees and leaving it there. Supporting this theory were not only the clay traces, but also the forensic analysis, indicating that Debbie was already dead when brought to the forest. If the perpetrator had killed her there would have been signs of a struggle around that area. The traces on the ground from the trail into the trees also suggested that the victim was already dead. The clay mining sites were very far away and hard to get to. Detectives thought that the killer may have worked there. They contacted the mining companies, and a supervisor from one of them supported this idea. It seemed unlikely that someone who didn't know the area could have brought the abducted girl there. Even the workers themselves sometimes find it challenging to move around in these large areas. Police checked employees from both companies, trying to find a man matching the description or the similar vehicle, but it didn't lead to anything. They also had fingerprints left on the car just inches away from the abduction site and compared them with all suspects, but this yielded no results either. The news of Debbie's brutal murder shook the entire city, and thousands of people came to bid farewell at her funeral. The local police department continued their efforts to find the killer and bring them to justice. But they couldn't find any new leads, hitting dead ends over and over again. Eventually, the case remained unsolved for many years. Detectives continued to work on it, checking dozens of suspects, but they couldn't establish their involvement. For the lead detective on the case, Morris Nix, Debbie's murder remained a priority throughout his entire career. The crime happened when he was just 19, and he had been involved in the search and investigation from day one. For many years, Nix pursued various leads, scrutinized different suspects, and eventually compiled a list of 4 men whom he considered the most likely suspects. When the FBI established a DNA database, experts were able to extract the genetic profile of the perpetrator from the hair found on Debbie's body. It was entered into the database, but no matches were found. The killer may not have been convicted of other serious crimes, or the crime happened before the collection of DNA samples. In 2015, 43 years later, the case was reopened. Detectives used modern technology to re-examine the victim's clothing, which had been stored in the evidence warehouse. They found biological material from an unknown man on it, but it had degraded over time, leading to a partial profile. In 2018, Debbie's mother shared her feelings in an interview. She expressed her long-standing hope to witness the police arresting her daughter's killer and ensuring accountability. After Debbie's tragic death, she found it unbearable to stay in the apartment filled with memories of her loss. Consequently, she relocated to a different city. Over the years, the lack of advancement in the investigation took a toll on her, causing slow devastation. Her sole wish now is to witness the resolution of this case before her time runs out. Unfortunately, that was not meant to happen. Just a few weeks after the interview, she passed away due to cancer at the age of 78, and she was laid to rest next to her daughter. Sandra, who witnessed the abduction at the age of 12, also spoke out in an interview. She said that she had never stopped blaming herself over the years. According to Sandra, she believed she could have stopped the perpetrator and prevented the abduction, even if it meant taking Debbie's place and dying. In 2019, the local police department received additional funding, enabling them to request a more detailed analysis of Debbie's clothing. This time, experts were able to extract a full DNA sample from it, but the perpetrator's DNA still wasn't in the FBI database. Debbie's father was also interviewed, and he shared that not a day had gone by over the decades when he didn't think about Debbie. He still kept a box of her old photos, hoping for only one thing: to reunite with his daughter in heaven. In 2022, shortly after the interview, he passed away. In the same year, detectives focused all their efforts on the one lead they had, DNA. They reached out to a company in Florida specializing in an innovative DNA analysis method called genetic genealogy. The police handed over all the biological samples they had collected over the years and waited. Experts created a profile of the unknown man and began searching for his relatives in public genetic databases. They needed to find people who had uploaded their DNA because family members' genetic material has similarities modern tools can detect, even distant relatives. After examining thousands of potential relatives of the killer, investigators narrowed down their search to a family living in Marietta in 2023. They asked them to provide DNA samples, and they agreed. The analysis showed that the killer was indeed their close relative. So experts looked into their family more carefully and soon identified the most likely owner of the killer's DNA sample, a man named William Rose. However, there was a problem. Rose had taken his own life in 1974, just 2 years after Debbie's murder. But detectives were determined to finally close this case, no matter what. They obtained a warrant to exhume his grave, and experts took a direct DNA sample from his remains. After 51 years since Debbie's murder, the police finally got a full match. William Rose was indeed the killer. At the time of the murder, he was only 24 years old and had never been a suspect. It turned out that his relatives lived in the same building as Debbie's family. Rose regularly visited them, so investigators believe that he might have seen the girl on multiple occasions. Perhaps that evening, he was headed to visit his relatives, but saw Debbie coming out of the laundromat and heading towards her home. Based on the testimonies of her neighbors and other witnesses, Rose pulled into the parking lot between the victim's house and the laundromat, left the engine running, got out, grabbed Debbie, and then drove north. Perhaps he immediately headed to the clay quarry, which was located in that direction. It's worth mentioning that Rose didn't have any other criminal record. Either he didn't commit anything serious besides Debbie's murder, or he simply didn't get caught at the time. When the case was solved, the only living close relative of the victim was her older brother, Melvin. He attended the press conference where they announced the discovery of the culprit and thanked everyone who had worked on his sister's case for over half a century. He also said he wished his mom could have lived to see this moment, but added that she was now in heaven with Debbie. Today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you, the case of Doreen Erbert. Doreen Erbert was born on November 29, 1952, in California. She grew up in a very large family with 5 children. Doreen was a kind and positive person who always sought to help others. Since her school years, she decided to pursue a career that would allow her to help people. After college, she moved to San Francisco and started working as a physiotherapist. Doreen also dreamed of creating her own big family. When she was 24 years old, she met a man named Michael Dennis, who worked at a factory near her clinic. The couple began dating, and a few months later, they decided to get married. In 1976, their son Paul was born. Initially, Michael and Doreen were happy together, but after the birth of their child, their relationship started to deteriorate. Within a year, they decided to divorce, and their son stayed with his mother, while Michael could regularly visit him. A year later, Doreen met a man named Charles. They began dating, got married, and decided to move to San Jose, settling in a quiet residential area. In 1979, their daughter Diana was born. Charles, like his wife, dreamed of having a big family. He raised her son and was overjoyed at the arrival of their daughter. However, a tragic incident occurred in the family in February 1980 when 4-year-old Paul climbed over the fence surrounding their pool and fell into the water. Doreen, who was at home at the time, noticed it too late. She pulled her son out of the water and called for an ambulance. They took the child to the hospital and connected him to a life support machine, but after 10 days, the doctors concluded that there was no chance of survival. The decision was made to disconnect him from the machine. Doreen was broken, and she couldn't stop blaming herself, even though the police investigation showed it wasn't her fault. Nevertheless, the woman continued to live, and her little daughter helped her cope with this tragedy. 4 years after the tragic events, something good finally happened with the family. Doreen and Charles had been trying to have another child for a long time, but unfortunately, the pregnancies had been interrupted twice. Eventually, Doreen became pregnant again, and this time, everything was going well. The couple was expecting the arrival of a boy, scheduled to be born in early November. Just a few days before Doreen was supposed to go to the hospital, the family decided to participate in Halloween activities. It was the evening of October 31st, and all the neighbors decorated their homes, handed out candies, and went trick-or-treating with their children in the neighborhood. Diana, who was 4 at the time, really wanted to join in, and her parents couldn't refuse. Despite Doreen being 9 months pregnant, she went trick-or-treating with her daughter, while Charles stayed home, handing out candies to other kids. The mother and daughter returned home shortly before 9 p.m. Charles informed his wife that they were running out of candies, and he planned to drive to the nearest store to refill their supplies because he didn't want to leave the neighborhood kids without treats. He left the house around 8:50 p.m. and returned approximately 15 minutes later. Approaching the house, he noticed that the front door was slightly open, which seemed unusual. However, what he encountered inside was a genuine nightmare. Upon entering, he discovered his wife Doreen lying on the corridor floor, surrounded by a substantial amount of blood. Doreen showed no signs of life, and Charles immediately called 911. Soon, he noticed that the body of their unborn child lay in the living room. The man was in a deep state of shock, unable to believe what he was witnessing. At one point, the thought crossed his mind that Doreen might have had a miscarriage, but he quickly realized the situation was much more severe. Next to the child's body, he found a human hand, and Charles immediately understood it belonged to Doreen. Realizing that someone had attacked his family, he began searching for his daughter, fearing that something might have happened to her as well. There was so much blood on the floor that the man even slipped and fell while running through the house. Fortunately, the girl was alive. She was hiding behind the sofa in the living room. When the ambulance arrived, paramedics found a weak pulse in Doreen and rushed her to the hospital. Unfortunately, they couldn't save her, and she passed away in the ambulance. Her child also did not survive. Besides being removed from the woman's womb, the unknown assailant had inflicted numerous blows on the baby. Medical experts examined Doreen's body and concluded that she had been struck numerous times with a long, sharp object resembling a sword or machete. Meanwhile, the police investigated the house, which resembled a scene from a horrific horror movie. Later, several officers sought psychological help, as even they couldn't cope with what they had witnessed. Blood was everywhere, on the floor, walls, and even the ceiling. Investigators examined the entire house, but didn't find the perpetrator or any clues outside the house. Police saw bloody footprints on the sidewalk, which stopped in the middle of the road, leading investigators to believe the killer had gotten into a car at that spot. Soon, officers discovered another clue on the lawn in front of the house, a wolf mask covered in blood. They speculated that it might belong to the killer. As Charles stated, they never owned such a mask. The evidence was sent to the laboratory, and police tried to talk to Diana, the girl who was the sole witness to what happened, and potentially could help identify the assailant. Diana told them that shortly after her father left for the store, someone knocked on their door. Doreen went to answer and saw a man in a wolf mask holding a long blade. He told her, "I'm going to kill you now." After that, the woman screamed at her daughter to run out of the house, and the girl hid behind the sofa. Diana couldn't recall what happened next until the moment when her father found her. She also couldn't help the police identify the attacker, as he was wearing a wolf mask. Initially, investigators considered the victim's husband, Charles, as a suspect. They found it suspicious that his trip to the store coincided with the arrival of the killer. As Doreen was attacked just minutes after her husband left home. When Charles returned, he stepped on blood multiple times, even falling and getting covered in it. Police didn't rule out the possibility that he might have done this intentionally to have an excuse for the blood on his clothes. However, detectives quickly found several inconsistencies in this theory. Firstly, Charles's shoes clearly didn't match those that left bloody footprints on the street. Secondly, the killer likely got into a car parked on the road in front of the house, but there were no blood traces found in Charles's vehicle or a different pair of shoes. Police went to the store Charles visited and spoke to the staff member who confirmed that Charles did buy candies from him that evening, indicating he didn't have time to commit the murder. Surveillance footage from the store also supported this alibi, so detectives temporarily stopped considering him the prime suspect. They asked Charles if he had anyone in mind who might wish harm to his family, and the men immediately pointed to Doreen's ex-husband, Michael. According to Charles, initially, Michael maintained a normal relationship with his ex-wife, but everything changed after the death of their son, who drowned in the pool. Michael blamed Doreen, believing she deliberately killed the boy to cut all connections with him. He even filed a civil lawsuit against her, seeking to hold her responsible for the child's death, but lost the case. Even during the time when Michael and Doreen were still married, he occasionally behaved quite strangely. After the birth of their son, he often fell into depression, distancing himself from both his wife and child. Doreen believed all of this somehow connected to his childhood traumas. Michael had hearing problems from an early age, requiring him to constantly wear a bulky hearing aid. In those days, it was a rather large device, and because of it, other children constantly teased Michael. All of this led to the man growing up introverted, practically having no friends, and avoiding interaction with women. Despite seemingly leaving these issues behind after meeting Doreen, Michael couldn't shake off his old problems completely. This became one of the main reasons for the couple's decision to divorce. When Doreen married Charles, Michael began harboring resentment and animosity towards her, especially disliking the fact that another man was raising his son. These feelings intensified after Paul's death, and he started genuinely hating his ex-wife. Michael also lost his job, where he had spent most of his adult life, and this factor also had some negative effect on him. After hearing all of this, the detectives decided to go to the man's house and talk to him. Charles's account was clearly insufficient to make Michael the prime suspect, but since he lived only 2 miles from Doreen's house, they decided to pay him a visit right away. Officers arrived at his home around midnight and saw the pickup truck parked near the garage. They shined a flashlight inside and saw something resembling blood on the steering wheel and keys. Afterward, they knocked on the door, but nobody answered. The lights were on, and officers could hear water running inside the house, leading them to suspect that the man might be disposing of evidence or cleaning blood-stained clothes. So they continued knocking. Michael eventually opened the door. He remained calm, even after being informed about his ex-wife's murder. The man answered all their questions nonchalantly and allowed the officers inside without a warrant. According to him, he went to the store during the day, returned home, and hadn't left since. Michael even agreed to sign voluntary consent papers to allow a search of his house. As he reached for the pen to sign, investigators noticed a deep cut on his right hand. Michael claimed he accidentally cut himself earlier while carving a pumpkin for Halloween, but the police doubted his words. The wound was visibly fresh, and blood was still oozing from it. Meanwhile, a few officers started searching his house. Michael went upstairs with one of them since they asked him to show his ID. When they entered his bedroom, Michael reached for the bed headboard, but the officer immediately told him to step aside. His actions seemed suspicious. Why would he keep his documents behind the bed? When the officer approached, he saw a holster hanging on the bed headboard with a loaded gun inside. He took the weapon and led Michael downstairs to the other officers. Meanwhile, his colleagues discovered blood droplets on the floor, leading them to a washing machine in the garage and a pile of clothes with blood stains. This was sufficient for an arrest, and they took the man into custody. Afterward, detectives, along with forensic experts, scrutinized the house more thoroughly, seeking evidence that might link Michael to the murder. The analysis of the blood would take a few days, and meanwhile, the police found some new gruesome discoveries. At first, they uncovered an empty box for a machete with an 18-inch blade. Medical experts confirmed that it perfectly matched the wounds on Doreen's body. Secondly, Michael had 2 makeshift coffins in his house, leading detectives to suspect they were intended for Doreen and her husband. Additionally, the police found body bags typically used by medical staff. Considering Michael had no association with these items, it raised significant suspicion. Putting all these pieces together, the police went to the judge to request a warrant for the suspect's arrest for an extended period. Without it, they could only detain him for a limited time. However, the judge deemed the evidence too circumstantial, and as a result, Michael had to be released, and the man walked free. Nevertheless, 3 days later, the detectives got the answer from the lab. Experts found 2 types of blood at the crime scene belonging to different individuals. Blood type analysis revealed that the majority of it shared the same blood type as Doreen, with a small amount matching Michael's. Apparently, the man injured himself during the attack on his ex-wife. This time, the judge promptly issued an arrest warrant, and Michael was officially charged with the murder of his ex-wife and her unborn child. They learned he owned the exact same wolf mask found near Doreen's house on the previous Halloween. He wore it to a party, and police even discovered a photo of Michael wearing the mask to eliminate any doubts. They found in his home the exact clothing he wore in that photo. But the story of the mask didn't end there. To further strengthen the case, police interviewed all of Doreen's neighbors about that evening. It turned out that children going door to door for candy saw an adult man wearing a wolf mask standing across the street from the victim's house, staring at it. Michael's trial began in July 1988, 4 years after the murder. Initially, he pleaded guilty, but later changed his plea. He didn't deny committing the murder, but claimed innocence due to mental health issues. A psychologist assigned to him concluded that he indeed had serious mental problems. Michael told the psychologist that witnessing other kids joyfully trick-or-treating on Halloween reminded him of Paul's death, triggering his breakdown. According to Michael, he went to Doreen's house with a machete on that evening. When she opened the door, he said, "You killed my son," and added that he intended to murder her. She immediately recognized him as the man behind the mask, screamed for her daughter to run, and in the next second, Michael attacked her. Michael insisted that he was unaware of Doreen's pregnancy, a claim that seemed hard to believe, as her friends insisted it was impossible not to notice her pregnancy before the tragedy. They even joked that because of her belly, Doreen had become broader than taller. The prosecution argued that the man was fully aware of his actions and had planned the crime in advance. During the investigation, detectives discovered he had told friends about his desire to kill his ex-wife and her husband, then dispose of their bodies in the bay. Given that they found 2 body bags in his home, the prosecution suggested he intended to carry out this plan, but changed his mind for some reason. Perhaps he panicked or feared staying in the house too long, thinking he might get caught. Doreen's daughter Diana also testified at the trial. At that time, she was 9 years old and still vividly remembered what happened. Charles didn't want his daughter to go through such a traumatic experience, but she was the only witness. The trial spanned a year, and in the end, the man was found guilty of murdering Doreen and her child. Michael was sentenced to death, but while he awaited execution, California imposed a moratorium on the death penalty. As a result, Michael remains behind bars to this day, and his sentence is unlikely to be carried out anytime soon. Many years later, Diana revealed that this murder haunted her throughout her life, never allowing her to forget that horror for a moment. Eventually, she decided to forgive Michael and try to leave it all in the past, fearing she might lose her sanity otherwise. Today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you, the case of Crystal Perry. Crystal Perry was born on August 23, 1963, in the small American town of Rumford, Maine. She was the youngest of 10 children, and their parents had to provide for all of them, which was understandably a challenge. Crystal and her siblings grew up quite independently with strict parents, unable to watch over all the kids. Their older sister, who was just 12 when Crystal was born, took care of them like a mother, always looking out for her younger brothers and sisters. Growing up in a tense environment, they all wanted to start their own separate lives as soon as possible. Eventually, they scattered to different cities and states. Crystal was no exception. She wanted to start a family of her own and met a guy named Tom in high school. They soon got married and moved to California, but eventually, Crystal realized that big city life just wasn't for her. After a year and a half, they decided to return to Maine, settling in a small town called Bridgeton, about an hour away from her hometown. Crystal got a job at a local shoe shop, while Tom took on various odd jobs. Soon, Crystal discovered she was pregnant, and they welcomed their daughter, Sarah. Despite the fact that Tom had initially wanted to be a father, their relationship with Crystal became complicated after their daughter's birth. He spent more and more time at a local bar, squandering almost all their money on alcohol. Once, he even took the money Crystal had set aside for groceries, as they didn't earn much. Tom's drinking habit sometimes left them with no money even for food. At some point, Crystal decided to file for divorce. Tom continued to see his daughter from time to time, but wasn't actively involved in her life. The situation escalated when Tom got a new girlfriend who started to harass Crystal. She called and threatened Crystal, show up at her place, and cause scenes, all because she simply didn't like that Crystal and Tom had once been married. Afraid to let Sarah visit her father, Crystal moved in with her mother. Over the years, she worked hard to save enough money to buy a house of her own. A few years later, she finally had the opportunity and purchased a small house on the outskirts of Bridgeton. The house was located just a few dozen yards from a picturesque lake surrounded by a forest. Crystal and Sarah were thrilled to have their own home just for the two of them. On May 10, 1994, when Crystal was 30 and Sarah was 12, they watched a solar eclipse together. The next day, as usual, Crystal went to work and Sarah to school. In the evening, they had dinner together, and Crystal tucked her daughter into bed. A few hours later, Sarah suddenly woke up to a loud scream. At first, she thought her mom was arguing with someone on the phone, but she quickly realized it was much more serious. Crystal was screaming at the top of her lungs, and Sarah immediately thought someone was attacking her mom. The door to her bedroom was slightly ajar, and through her fear, she came closer to it. Sarah realized that the screams were coming from the kitchen, but she couldn't see what was happening from where she stood. Sarah was gripped by fear and afraid to move or make any sound. After a few seconds, she heard footsteps and thought that whoever had attacked her mom was coming for her. She hid behind the bed, waiting for her door to swing open at any moment. Instead, she heard the kitchen drawer open, followed by a sound like someone was rummaging through the silverware. Crystal continued to scream and beg for mercy, and in the next few seconds, Sarah heard sounds as if someone had started stabbing her mom with a knife. With each new stab wound, her cries became increasingly muffled until they stopped completely. Despite being only 12, Sarah understood clearly that some unknown criminal was killing her mom. She wanted to rush to her mother's aid, but was paralyzed with fear. Sarah also realized that she had no chance against the knife-wielding person, and they would likely just kill her too. After her mother's screams stopped, Sarah couldn't move for several minutes. She waited for the criminal to come to her room, but the house was eerily silent. She finally left her room and went to the kitchen, where she encountered a disturbing scene. The lights were off, and the room was only illuminated by the moonlight through the window. As Sarah approached the kitchen, she glanced at the wall clock and saw that it was exactly 1 a.m. On the kitchen floor, she found her mother lying in a pool of blood that covered the entire floor. Despite being in a state of shock, Sarah recognized the urgency of getting help as soon as possible. Next to her mother's hand, she saw the telephone receiver. She picked it up and dialed 911, but there was complete silence on the line. Sarah then rushed to Crystal's room, where the second phone was, and tried to call the police again, but this number also did not work. She dialed the numbers several times, then realized she had only one option left: seeking assistance from the neighbors. Sarah rushed out into the street in just her pajamas, barefoot. It was May, and the temperature was quite low. It had also been raining that night. But she didn't think about anything except helping her mother. The closest house was around half a mile down the road towards the city center. She reached it and began knocking on the door, but no one answered. Sarah then ran to other houses, but again, no one opened the door. She kept running towards the city center, knocking on several more doors, but still no one responded. Eventually, she reached an Italian restaurant where the owners lived in the attached building. This time, they finally opened the door. Sarah told them that someone had attacked her mother, and the shocked residents led her inside. Sarah called 911 herself and reported what had happened. The officers immediately headed to their house. The first thing they noticed was the amount of blood. It was literally everywhere, on the floor, walls, and practically on every kitchen item. Crystal was dead, and the medical experts could tell at a glance that she had almost no chance of survival, even if she had received help immediately after the attack. Given the severe blood loss, it would have been impossible to save her. On the front door glass, the police found a palm print, but quickly realized it likely belonged to Sarah. No other fingerprints were found at the crime scene, but there were numerous shoe prints on the kitchen floor, stained with blood. Investigators took photos to try to determine the size and model of the shoes, thinking they had most likely belonged to the killer. The prints also led toward Sarah's bedroom, but for some reason, the perpetrator turned back and didn't enter the room. Detectives also noticed a strange detail. Apparently, the killer tried to wipe away some of the blood from the floor. Considering that almost the entire kitchen was covered in it, along with Crystal herself, this seemed odd. It was obvious he couldn't have wiped away all the blood. Then detectives noticed that some blood drops on the floor were in different shapes. Most of them looked as if they had landed at an angle. According to investigators, they had likely flown off the knife the perpetrator used to attack the victim, but there were also other drops that had fallen on the floor at a right angle and, judging by the splatters, from a greater height. Detectives speculated that apparently the perpetrator had injured themselves during the murder, and this blood belonged to them. Another confirmation of this theory was the fact that these drops led to a roll of paper towels, and there were none left on the way out of the house. Most likely, the killer used these towels to stop the bleeding and immediately left the crime scene. Medical experts found over 50 stab wounds on Crystal's body. The murder weapon was not found in the house, leading detectives to believe that the perpetrator took it with them. Experts only confirmed that it must have been a kitchen knife. The killer struck with such force that a piece broke off and lodged into the victim's body. Crystal had also been sexually assaulted, and experts were able to extract a sample of the perpetrator's semen along with the blood drops. It was sent to the lab. However, there was a problem. Due to funding shortages, the local laboratory was quite overloaded, so results would take at least 6 months. As a result, detectives had to begin the investigation without any evidence. First, they ruled out robbery, since nothing was missing from the house. There were no signs of forced entry either, leading police to speculate that the victim had opened the door to the perpetrator herself. She was in her pajamas, suggesting she was unlikely expecting guests. Investigators theorized that she either knew the killer or someone unfamiliar knocked on the door and convinced her to let them in under some pretext. The detective decided to start with the only witness, Sarah. They went to the hospital where she was being held for health checks and began questioning her. The police asked why she ran to the neighbors instead of calling 911 from home. Sarah replied that both their phones weren't working. But this answer seemed strange to the investigators when they arrived at the crime scene and were able to make calls without any problems. The detectives assumed that in such a stressful situation, Sarah could have simply gotten confused. The receiver of the first phone was off the hook, and to make a call, it needed to be placed back. As for the second phone, they didn't rule out that Sarah might have dialed the wrong number in haste, or the phone line might have temporarily gone out due to the rain. Then the police started asking her if she saw the killer. Sarah responded that she had not left her bedroom until it was all over, but the police treated her story with a bit of skepticism. They asked how she could know that her mother was attacked with a knife. Sarah replied that it was obvious, but the detectives continued to press her. They felt that she might be withholding some information and that she had actually seen the perpetrator. In the first 3 days after the murder, the police interrogated Sarah 18 times, hoping that her story would change. But she continued to insist that everything had happened as she told them. While pursuing other leads, detectives stumbled upon their first breakthrough. They found a pair of boots at a local shoe store, whose sole patterns matched the bloody footprints on the floor. They also discovered that Crystal had been harassed by Teresa, the girlfriend of her ex-husband. Despite the killer being obviously a man, the police decided to investigate her, considering that Teresa had repeatedly threatened the victim with murder. They could have found an accomplice and convinced him to commit the crime. However, detectives found no evidence to support this theory. Investigators then learned that at the time of her death, Crystal was seeing a man named Dennis. They had met 2 years prior when he started working in the shoe shop, and they began dating shortly after. Dennis eventually proposed to her, and although Crystal agreed, they never got married. Detectives found out that their relationship was quite tense. Crystal and Dennis argued a lot, and sometimes he displayed aggressive behavior, such as breaking things or hitting the wall. However, the police couldn't find any evidence that he had ever raised a hand on Crystal. The next day after the murder, they went to his house. When he opened the door, the investigators asked if he had left his house that night or seen Crystal. Dennis immediately asked if she was dead, and in the next second, he collapsed on the floor. After he regained consciousness, he began answering the detectives' questions. Dennis confirmed that he had planned to visit Crystal that evening, but got delayed after work, helping a friend fix a car. Upon returning home, he called Crystal, but she said it was too late, leading to an argument, and Dennis ended up staying home. While the police couldn't be 100% sure he was telling the truth, they were able to verify that he did help his friend that evening. Dennis also agreed to a polygraph test, and the operator didn't detect any signals of lying, except for one when he asked if he felt responsible for Crystal's death. Dennis answered no. Detectives also noticed that he had the same shoe size as the killer, but they found no matching footwear in Dennis's house. He agreed to provide a DNA sample, but made a strange request. He asked the detectives to come to his workplace through the back door to avoid disturbing others if they decided to arrest him. He explained that his boss had always treated him well, and he didn't want to disrupt the workflow. Considering that he continued to insist on his innocence, this request seemed suspicious. The police found out that Crystal's best friend, who lived in another town, had told them that just a few weeks before, Crystal had called her and said that she was scared of Dennis. Their arguments were becoming increasingly tense, and Dennis was growing more aggressive with each altercation. Crystal even thought about breaking up with him, but feared his reaction. During the conversation, she didn't provide any useful information, but as soon as the police left her workplace, Dennis came in and started asking what she had told the detectives. Despite their efforts, there was no evidence against the man, and the DNA test results would take months, so the police kept looking for other clues. They soon received a strange tip. A local man named Donnie got drunk at a party and started bragging about having killed Crystal. They took him in for questioning, but he claimed to have no memory of the party and denied any involvement in the murder. The investigators later discovered that Donnie was an alcoholic and a known liar. Another witness reported seeing a black pickup truck with New Hampshire plates near Crystal's house, but this lead didn't lead anywhere either. One woman told the police that on the night of the murder, she was driving past Sarah's house when she heard sirens and thought they were for her boyfriend, who lived down the road. At the same time, she saw a car with high beams on, following her at high speed. Thinking the driver was chasing her, she turned onto another road, but the car passed her by. However, the police couldn't confirm if this car was somehow related to the murder. Since then, the police struggled to find any solid leads. Crystal's relatives pulled together $10,000 as a reward for any information on the case, and they also distributed flyers around town, hoping to attract new witnesses. It's worth mentioning that Teresa, the girlfriend of Crystal's ex-husband, was seen tearing down these flyers multiple times. As for the ex-husband himself, he was thoroughly investigated, but detectives eventually doubted his involvement. Over the years, his alcohol problems became even worse, and now Tom drank heavily every day. In his condition, it seemed unlikely he could have committed such a crime, and he had no clear motive. The police also looked into 2 other men Crystal dated after divorcing her husband, but they found no evidence linking them to the case. All of them, including Tom, provided DNA samples, leaving detectives waiting for the lab results. 9 months after the murder, investigators finally received the results, which showed that the blood and semen samples didn't match any of the suspects, including Dennis. This left detectives with no other leads. They requested Dennis's sample again for additional testing, but the results remained the same. Stuck in a dead end, investigators decided to revisit their only witness, Sarah. They still assumed that either she was lying to them or her mind had blocked out the horrific memories of her mother's murder, and she actually saw the killer at that time. Sarah was living with her aunt in Texas, so the police headed to the other end of the country to question her. They polygraphed her, but the operator didn't detect any false answers. Despite this, investigators continued talking to her day after day, asking the same questions, but each time, she replied that she didn't see the killer. After that, the case remained unsolved for several years. The police kept interviewing people, checking various suspects, but it yielded no results. In the late 90s, when the FBI DNA database became available, investigators uploaded the sample of Crystal's killer, but no matches were found. In 1999, a new detective was assigned to the case. He decided not only to review all existing evidence, but also to collect DNA samples from as many men as possible living in the town and nearby areas. By then, the laboratory could conduct tests much faster, and the police obtained hundreds of samples, but none of them matched. The new detective also reached out to Sarah and persuaded her to work with a psychologist to try to recover suppressed memories. She agreed, but the psychologist concluded that Sarah truly didn't remember anything and was telling the truth about not seeing the perpetrator. Since then, the case remained unsolved for many years. Detectives kept working on it, but couldn't find any new leads. This continued until 2006, when something unexpected happened. Detectives received a message. A DNA sample was entered into the FBI database, and it matched with the blood and semen left by Crystal's killer. The owner of the DNA turned out to be a man named Michael Hutchinson, who had never been a suspect in the case. Detectives found out that in 2003, he was arrested for assault and threats with a weapon, resulting in a 6-month prison sentence and 3 years of probation. At the time, his DNA sample was taken, but for some reason, it wasn't uploaded to the FBI database and remained stored in the lab. 3 years later, Michael was arrested for drunk driving with his children in the car. He was released on bail, but he didn't show up for his court hearing, so he was sent to prison. Michael was also arrested right at his own wedding and placed in a cell. His DNA sample was taken again, and this time, it was immediately uploaded to the database. Soon after, investigators in Crystal's case received a match. The detective called Sarah and informed her about this, but asked her to keep the information secret until the official charges were filed. He also asked if she knew this person, and Sarah said no. Considering that Michael was already behind bars, the detective began slowly building the case to ensure that the suspect had no chance of escaping punishment. He found out that at the time of the murder, Michael lived in Bridgeton, just 2 miles from Crystal's house. Michael, who was 19 at the time, lived near the Italian restaurant where Sarah called the police. He drove to his mother's house almost every day, which was just a little further away than Crystal's house, so Michael regularly passed by it. For the detective, it meant that he could have seen Crystal multiple times. Eventually, he went to see Michael in prison, but the man claimed to have no connection to the murder and said he never knew the victim. Considering that his DNA was found on her body and his blood was found at the crime scene, the detective didn't rush to believe him. While in prison, the detective noticed something interesting. Michael had a large scar on his palm, and as we recall, Crystal's killer likely cut his hand during the murder. Although in court this could not be considered strong evidence, the presence of DNA was more than sufficient, so Michael was finally charged with murder. According to the prosecution, the man, a known user of illegal substances, had repeatedly seen Crystal as he passed by her house on that fateful night. He decided to assault her, and considering that he refused to confess, it was difficult to speculate on how exactly everything happened. But with the available evidence, the outcome was clear. Michael assaulted and killed her. During the trial, an explanation was also found for the fact that the killer managed to not leave a single fingerprint at the crime scene. The answer was quite unexpected. Michael worked as a bricklayer, and over time, people who have been engaged in this job begin to wear away the patterns on their palms, making it physically impossible for them to leave fingerprints on various surfaces. In his defense, Michael told his version of events. He said he met Crystal at a bar and they went back to her place, where they had consensual intercourse. At some point, an unknown man in a black motorcycle jacket burst into the house, knocked Michael out, and killed Crystal. When he regained consciousness, Michael tried to fight off the attacker, but the assailant injured him in the hand and fled. Michael himself also decided to leave the crime scene without any reasonable explanation. His story obviously seemed highly doubtful. The only shoe prints on the floor also belonged to him. If his story was true, the intruder would have had to take off his shoes before breaking into the house, and it still wouldn't have explained the absence of any other marks on the floor. Furthermore, there wasn't a single witness who saw Crystal at that bar. The trial ended on April 9, 2007, and Michael was unanimously found guilty. He received a life sentence without the possibility of parole and remains in prison to this day. As for Sarah, her mother's murder undoubtedly had a critical impact on her. However, over the years, she found the strength to move forward. She attended college, became a writer, and published a book about her mother's murder, compiling all the available information. Moreover, when she was working on the book, Sarah managed to uncover new facts overlooked by the police. She discovered that during those years, Michael often borrowed his father's car, a black Ford pickup truck with New Hampshire license plates. As we recall, one witness reported seeing such a vehicle near Crystal's house. She also remembered the woman who told the police about the car with its high beams on, speeding past her on the night of the murder. At the time, the woman mentioned she mistook the ambulance sirens for police and thought they were heading to her boyfriend's house. That boyfriend was Michael. The police put his name in an address in the report, but back then, they decided there was no connection and didn't bother to investigate him further. Perhaps if the police had decided to speak with him, they would have noticed the cut on his hand, and the case would have been solved much sooner. Today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you. Christy Lynn Mullins was born on August 28, 1960, in Columbus, Ohio. She grew up in a large family with 5 children, living in a quiet neighborhood away from the hustle and bustle of the city. In the summer of 1975, when Christy was 14, she spent most of her time hanging out with her friends and her sisters, and their favorite spot was the pool at the nearby residential complex, especially on hot summer days. Sometimes she also worked as a babysitter, looking after the kids of people she knew. On August 22nd, one of them asked Christy to watch her child until late in the evening. The next day, Christy woke up around noon and began pondering what to do with her birthday, just 5 days away. She was eagerly anticipating it, so time seemed to pass very slowly for her. The day turned out to be extremely hot. Christy decided to go to the pool with her sister Kim to cool off. Kim went in the water while Christy relaxed on a chair. Later, Christy left without saying anything to Kim. Kim then headed home and found her missing. Around 2:30 p.m., a man called 911 to report finding a human body in the wooded area behind the shopping center. He, along with his wife and son, went there to buy a toy for their son. Their son expressed a desire to stroll through the wooded area behind the shopping center before they entered. There was a well-known trail among the trees that led to the river, and overall the place was quite picturesque, so people often went there just for walks. His parents agreed, and they walked along this path into the depths of the forest. As the family was coming back, they noticed something strange happening a few yards off the trail. Upon closer inspection, they saw a man on the ground, leaning over someone and striking them with a piece of wood. The man saw them, got up, and fled. The father approached the spot and discovered a girl on the ground, covered in blood. His wife, who was undergoing medical training, tried to find a pulse on the victim, but was unable to do so. The man ran to the shopping center and called the police from one of the stores. He and his wife provided investigators with a description of the perpetrator: a young, tall, slender man, around 20 years old, with long dark hair down to his shoulders, wearing only jean shorts and boots. Based on their description, the police created a sketch of the suspect and distributed it to patrol officers. The crime scene examination yielded no results. Officers found the piece of wood used as the murder weapon, but they couldn't find anything that could lead them to the perpetrator. It's worth noting that the victim's hands were tied with a telephone cord and her bikini top was pulled down. The t-shirt she was wearing that day was found next to the body, along with her shoes. Despite this, forensic experts didn't find evidence of sexual assault. Investigators speculated that the perpetrator intended to assault her, but something scared him off. Despite the lack of leads, the police quickly realized which direction to focus on. Christy's younger sister revealed that she left the pool with her friend named Carol, so the police went to talk to her. Carol said that on that day, an unknown man called her home, claiming to be a DJ from a local radio station. He said that there would be a cheerleading competition in their town, and the winners would get free tickets to the state fair. The caller claimed that the event would take place behind the shopping center and would start at 1:45 p.m. He told her to wait at the entrance to the trail in the woods where someone would meet her and explain everything. Obviously, this story seemed very suspicious to the police, but there were even more odd details. Carol claimed that initially she decided to go to this event with her sister, but halfway there, they ran into Christy and her sister. After a brief chat, Carol invited Christy to go with her, so they left the sisters behind and headed towards the shopping center. They arrived at the entrance to the woods and waited, sitting on the fence, but no one showed up. Sometime later, Carol said she would go to the shopping center to ask for the time. It took only a few minutes, but when she returned, Christy was no longer there. She waited for a while, but no one appeared, so eventually she left. The police found no evidence to support the claim of any cheerleading competitions in town. They assumed that the caller could have been the killer attempting to lure Carol into the woods, or it could have been some prank unrelated to the murder. Either way, they couldn't trace the call, making it impossible to identify the caller. Investigators also noticed a discrepancy in Carol's story. She said she met Christy and her sister on the street while walking to the shopping center. However, Kim insisted that they were at the pool and Carol came to them there. Late that same evening, Christie's mother encountered Carol, who lived just a few dozen yards from their home, and they had a rather strange conversation. Carol began apologizing to the woman and said that things weren't supposed to go this far. She added that she was supposed to be the target and that 2 people were involved in the murder. Shocked, Christie's mother tried to get more details, but Carol refused to continue the conversation and left. She reported this to the police, and they spoke with Carol again, but she claimed she hadn't said anything like that and insisted on the truthfulness of her initial testimony. Later, she was questioned again with a polygraph, and the operator didn't detect any signs of deception in response to important questions. After this, investigators shifted their focus away from Carol and continued searching for other leads. In the following days, as news of the brutal murder spread throughout the city, local residents were gripped by widespread fear, realizing that a dangerous criminal was still at large. The police believed the killer was a local resident, as they knew about the trail behind the shopping center. Detectives deployed all their resources to find the culprit, and 3 days after Christie's murder, there was a long-awaited breakthrough in the case. Around 5 p.m., a police officer was patrolling the center streets of Columbus when he spotted a man who remarkably resembled the sketch of Christie's killer. The patrol officers immediately contacted the detectives, who quickly arrived at the scene. They asked the man to go with them to the station to answer a few questions, and he agreed. He turned out to be 25-year-old Jack Carmen. Despite the fact that he voluntarily agreed to answer their questions, the police immediately faced a problem. The man had a significant intellectual disability. His IQ, according to various tests, was estimated to be around 50 points. Jack was under the care of a specialized medical institution and lived in an apartment provided by a non-profit organization where he worked. He couldn't read, write, and spoke poorly, but the detectives on Christie's case couldn't ignore the striking resemblance between him and the composite sketch. The interrogation proved to be very challenging. For most of the time, Jack responded to the detectives' questions with a single word or remained silent. The detectives also began to doubt whether he was fully capable of understanding and comprehending the meaning of their questions. The interrogation lasted for 6 hours, but eventually, the detectives made some progress by asking the most simple and straightforward questions possible. They were able to obtain the long-awaited confession from Jack. According to his account, on that day, he left his apartment and took a bus to the shopping center to purchase pants and a shirt. As he walked through the parking lot towards the entrance, he noticed Christie sitting on the fence near the start of the trail leading into the woods. He approached Christie, grabbed her, tied her hands, and dragged her into the woods, where he assaulted her. After that, Christie tried to escape, and that's when Jack caught up with her. He grabbed a piece of wood from the ground and struck her multiple times on the head. Then, he ran to the main road in front of the shopping center and jumped on a bus. The next day, the police took him to the forest, and Jack pointed out the spot where he committed the crime. He also provided investigators with details that only the perpetrator could know, such as the fact that the piece of wood broke in half when he struck the victim with it. The detectives also lined up several people, including Jack, and asked the couple who found Christie to identify the person they saw that day. Both pointed to Jack. He was charged with several offenses, including assault and murder, despite the fact that experts didn't find any evidence of sexual assault. Jack confessed to it, so the prosecution decided not to exclude it. The prosecutor sought the death penalty, but Jack's lawyer, with his consent, struck a deal. Jack had to admit his guilt before the judge and receive a life sentence instead of execution. Considering the high-profile nature of this case, with thousands of people following it, the judicial process moved swiftly. Jack was sentenced to life imprisonment just 11 days after the murder, on September 3rd. However, after the trial, many began to doubt Jack's guilt. As more details about his confession and his personality emerged in the media, more people started to question whether he could have truly committed such an act. Those who knew Jack initially found it hard to believe, as he was described as passive, timid, and compliant, someone who would easily acquiesce to any demands made of him. There were also doubts about Jack's ability to confess to the crime. He could barely speak, yet the police claimed that he had told them about the crime in utmost detail. Those who knew Jack believed that the investigators had simply fed him all the necessary information. They just needed to ask leading questions that already contained facts about the case. For example, did he strike the victim with a piece of wood? And if Jack answered yes, the police could already use it as a confession. One woman who was involved in Jack's treatment added that under threat, he could confess to anything. It was enough for him to hear that he faced the electric chair, and he would do whatever the detectives asked. But that's not all. Supporters of Jack's innocence found out that the police had brought him to the murder scene at the same time as the witnesses, the same married couple who later identified him among other people at the police station. So they had already seen Jack and knew that he was a suspect. The police had claimed that the witnesses didn't cross paths with Jack, but no one believed it. There were many more facts that raised strong doubts about Jack's involvement. For example, the police couldn't find the bus driver or even a single passenger who saw Jack on the way to the city center, according to his own confession. The most significant factor was the testimony of several people in the charity organization building where Jack lived and worked. They claimed to have seen him around 1:30 p.m. If he was indeed there, he had absolutely no chance of taking a bus to the shopping center on the outskirts of the city and committing the murder by 1:50 p.m. Even if he had left immediately after being seen by the witnesses, the bus would take at least 40 minutes to cover that distance. These facts made many people not just doubt Jack's guilt, but come to the conclusion that the police had essentially coerced his confession. Even Christie's parents started to doubt that he was the real killer. On September 9th, just 6 days after the verdict, around 70 people gathered in front of the city hall to draw attention to the case and demand a thorough investigation. They formed a public committee with the goal of seeking justice. Thanks to this, Jack found a new lawyer who quickly filed for a case review. Several months later, a judge revoked Jack's confession and ordered a new trial. Now the prosecution had to prove his guilt practically from scratch, which seemed like an almost impossible task. While preparations for the new trial were underway, Christie's father, Norman Mills, conducted his own investigation from the beginning. He didn't believe the detectives, thinking they weren't doing enough to find his Christie's killer. He decided not to rely on the police and started searching for answers himself. Soon after the murder, he and some neighbors went to the woods to inspect the area. There, they found jean shorts and blood-stained men's underwear, which they handed over to the police, who had initially overlooked them. However, it remained unknown whether these items were linked to the case or even tested. The new trial for Jack began only in 1977, 2 years after the murder. The defense had two main tasks: to prove Jack's innocence and to try to identify the real killer. They already had a strong candidate for this role, whom they considered the most likely suspect, the man who found Christie's body with his wife, Henry Newell, who was 25 years old at the time of the murder. By the start of the trial, Jack's lawyers had gathered an impressive list of reasons to suspect Henry for the murder, and during the trial, this list grew even longer. Initially, Henry drew attention because of his criminal record, starting from his teenage years, with numerous arrests for various offenses and 3 prison terms, from which he had successfully escaped twice before being caught and sent back. At the time of Jack's trial, he was serving his 4th sentence, this time for setting his own house on fire to collect insurance money. The lawyers reviewed the evidence in Christie's case and found several suspicious details in Henry's testimony. He said he found her body, approached it, and threw aside a piece of wood stained with blood, explaining that he was in shock. However, This action still seemed strange, as it was unclear why he would pick up the murder weapon and throw it away from the body without an apparent reason. He also claimed that he thought Christie was still alive, so he took off his shirt and pressed it to her face, which raised doubts about whether he genuinely tried to stop the bleeding or if his shirt became stained with blood during the murder, and he needed to justify it somehow. Jack's lawyers found a store employee in the mall where Henry ran to call the police, who said he wasn't wearing a shirt but had jean shorts on, although by the time the police arrived, he was already wearing different pants. The employee also claimed Henry had a fresh bruise on his face, as if someone had hit him, but when asked why she didn't immediately tell the police about this, she said no one simply asked her, and the officers themselves should have noticed the bruise but ignored it back then. Henry's neighbor said he saw Henry with fresh scratches on his hands the night of the murder. The neighbor also saw a phone cord in Henry's garage, matching the one used on the victim. Additionally, Henry had told the neighbor a strange story about knowing Carol's 14-year-old friend and swimming naked with her, which was shocking given Henry's age. Henry's wife, Pam, also testified in court, saying everything had happened exactly as they told the police on the first day they went to the mall, and their son wanted to take a walk. Pam added that up until that point, Henry had been at home and only stepped out for a few minutes to chase away the neighborhood kids who had started throwing firecrackers into their yard. Carol Christie also testified, stating that she had never met Henry. Henry himself was also brought into the courtroom from prison, where he repeated his story without any changes and insisted that he had nothing to do with the crime. One of the most significant moments of the trial was the display of the full recording of Jack's interrogation. After viewing, which it became apparent to everyone that Jack was simply coerced into confirming the detective's words that he had committed the murder. Jack barely spoke and apparently didn't fully understand what the police wanted from him. On the fifth day, another unexpected witness appeared, Bobby, Henry's stepson. His testimony truly shocked everyone. Following the case, the boy revealed that on that day, Henry did indeed leave the house to chase away kids throwing firecrackers in their yard. However, he was gone for more than just a few minutes, as his mother had claimed, but for over half an hour. When Henry returned home, his shirt and sandals were missing, and he had scratches on his arms and face. Henry called Pam into another room where they had a conversation, after which they came out and told Bobby that they were all going to the shopping center. Upon arriving, the parents immediately led him to the trail behind the shopping center. The boy claimed that he hadn't asked to go there for a walk, as his parents had initially stated. They entered the woods and almost immediately found Henry's sandals, one of which was torn. Further, they saw Christie's body, and his mother instructed Bobby never to tell anyone about what he saw. The boy added that he only decided to tell the truth after having a conversation with his biological father, who had convinced him to do the right thing. His grandmother also testified in court and recounted one strange episode involving Henry. She, along with him and Pam, attended Christie's farewell ceremony, and on the way back, the woman said what a tragedy it was, and Henry suddenly replied, "It will teach her to keep her mouth shut." Another witness was Henry's friend, who said that Henry once confessed to him that he killed Christie. He added that the killing was accidental, not planned. In the end, this trial left practically no doubt that Jack had no involvement in the crime, and eventually, all charges against him were dropped. However, here's where it gets interesting. Despite the overwhelming evidence pointing to Henry's involvement, the prosecutor stated that he had no intention of pursuing a case against him. He also noted that the initial investigation was conducted in the best possible way. However, the prosecutor pointed out that the police either failed to notice or ignored a vast amount of clues and evidence available to them from day one. His response sparked a wave of public outrage, and 2 days later, the prosecutor had to backtrack and agreed to reopen the investigation into Christie's case. But there was a serious problem. Investigators relied on the initial investigation, including the testimonies of Henry and Pam. In other words, the police still operated under the assumption that the couple stumbled upon Christie's body in the woods with a long-haired, shirtless man looming over her. For this reason, investigators stated that they would be looking for new suspects resembling Jack. Of course, such an approach yielded no results. The investigation continued for several months and eventually went cold. Christie's father never gave up on seeking justice, and once he filed a civil lawsuit against Jack, the reasons for such a move were not as simple as it might have seemed. The man didn't believe in Jack's involvement in the murder, but this legal process would have granted him access to the case files, giving him the opportunity to collect all the available information. Unfortunately, this also yielded no results. In 2006, Christie's father passed away from cancer, never having closure in the case. For a long time, there was no progress in the investigation of Christie's murder until 2013, when former attorney John Aller took an interest in the case. He decided to conduct his own investigation, reaching out to all involved parties, hoping to find new leads. Christie's relatives handed him a box containing all of her father's records, which he had been gathering up until his death. He went through it all, spoke to dozens of people, and it became evident to him that the culprit behind this murder was none other than Henry. During his investigation, he found out that Christie's friend Carol was into smoking marijuana at the time. Digging deeper, he uncovered something else and concluded that she, like some other teenagers, apparently was buying it from Henry. This became another link between him and Carol and could indicate the real reason why Christie went to that forest. He theorized that the whole story about the DJ was simply made up and that, in reality, Carol arranged to meet Henry in the forest to buy the illegal substance. Perhaps she decided to invite Christie along under some other pretext, such as using the same story about the DJ in a cheerleading competition. Another, much darker version suggested that Carol may have initially lured Christie there at Henry's request, who had planned to assault her. However, Christie fought back, as evidenced by the scratches and bruises on his body, and the man killed her. By that time, Henry had committed even more crimes, including domestic violence and assault. There was another incident linked to him, but he wasn't tried for it. The death of his wife Pam in 1982 was particularly concerning. Pam had filed for divorce, and just a month later, she was found dead in their apartment where she still lived with Henry. The official cause of death was a sleeping pill overdose, and the police found a note indicating that she had taken her own life. However, Pam's relatives didn't believe this version and suspected that Henry had tampered with the pills. The stranger part of this whole story was that no package of sleeping pills was found in the apartment, even though Pam obviously couldn't have disposed of it after taking such a large amount. That same year, in 2013, when the case was taken on, Henry passed away from cancer at the age of 63. Despite this, the investigators continued their work and released a book containing all available information about Christie's murder. The release of the book sparked a new wave of interest in the case, and Christie's relatives, along with other people, began demanding to reopen the investigation. Several of Henry's relatives also reached out to the investigators, stating that their entire family knew that he was the one who killed Christie, but had kept silent. One of them recounted that a few months before her 16th birthday, Henry had given her a car as a gift. They went for a ride together, and at some point, he asked her to stop, looked at her, and said that he had killed Christie, detailing the crime in full. The woman said she couldn't believe it, as she thought Henry had simply made up this story under the influence of alcohol. However, after reading the investigator's book, everything fell into place for her. This led to the reopening of the murder investigation in May of 2014. For many months, detectives re-examined all the available evidence, interviewed dozens of people, and re-evaluated the leads. In his confession to his relative, Henry mentioned that he had assaulted Christie. At the time, medical experts found no evidence of that, but now, With modern technology, they re-examined Christie's clothing and found traces of semen. Unfortunately, the traces were so small that conducting DNA analysis was simply impossible. The investigation continued until the end of 2015, when detectives called a press conference. 40 years after the murder, they finally announced that they have no doubt that Henry was the one who committed it. However, since he was no longer alive, they couldn't take this case to court. It was officially declared solved, and the investigation was closed. Without Henry's confession, investigators couldn't be 100% sure of exactly what had happened, but they had a strong idea. Most likely, when Henry had left home that day, he went to the trail behind the shopping center. Perhaps Carol invited him there so she could buy weed, but that part cannot be confirmed. Once there, he saw Christie alone and decided to assault her. He tied her hands with a phone cord and took her further into the woods, where she fought back. Christie managed to scratch him and hit him in the face, after which Henry likely knocked her down and killed her with a piece of wood he had found nearby. He then returned home, told his wife what had happened, and they both came up with a plan for him to avoid punishment. It's worth mentioning that Carol never told the truth after all these years. It's possible she was somehow involved, and we can't exclude that one day she'll come forward. During the press conference, the police also apologized to Christie's family for how negligently their predecessors had handled the case. There was enough evidence from the beginning to charge Henry with the murder, but the investigators either didn't notice it or simply ignored it. Today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you. The case of Tanya McKinley. Tanya McKinley, born January 25, 1961, in Milton, Florida, had a happy childhood with her older sister. After high school, she moved to Pensacola to become a medical transcriptionist, a quick career path requiring only special courses, not a medical degree. Her cousin Vanita chose to relocate with her, and the two women shared an apartment to save on rent. Soon after moving, Tanya met a guy named Tim, and they began dating. Eventually, they moved in together, and in 1983, their son Timothy was born. While Tanya was thrilled to become a mother, her relationship with Tim wasn't perfect. They argued quite often, and about a year after their child's birth, they decided to part ways. At the end of 1984, Tanya temporarily moved in with her cousin, who by that time had a husband and two children. Tanya planned to find a place of her own and move out as soon as she got the opportunity. On December 31st, Tanya, along with Vanita and her husband, decided to celebrate New Year's Eve at a local bar. They left their kids at a late-night daycare and set off to ring in the new year. They had a lively evening filled with laughter and dancing, and Tanya saw many familiar faces at the bar. When midnight struck, they welcomed the new year of 1985, and Vanita and her husband prepared to head home. The daycare where they had left their children was closing at 1 a.m., giving them just 1 hour to pick up their kids. However, Tanya wanted to stay at the bar a little longer. Since her sole focus had been on work and caring for her son for the past 2 years, this was her only chance to unwind and relax, and she didn't want to miss it. Tanya asked her sister to pick up her son from the daycare, and Vanita agreed because they lived together and Vanita had to collect her own children anyway. Before parting ways, Vanita asked Tanya how she planned to get home since they had arrived at the bar in Vanita's car, but Tanya assured her that she would easily find someone to give her a ride, given that there were many familiar faces at the bar. On the morning of January 1st, Vanita woke up and, to her surprise, realized that Tanya had not returned yet. It seemed odd, since she should have been back long ago. Vanita thought that Tanya might have gone to stay with one of her friends, so she wasn't overly concerned initially. However, everything changed soon after when Vanita's worried mother-in-law knocked on their door, delivering the shocking news that Tanya had been found dead. That night, around 3 a.m., a Pensacola resident and her daughter headed to a vet clinic due to some urgent health issues with their dog. As the woman left home, Her daughter noticed something strange on the roadside. She thought it was a mannequin and mentioned it to her mother. The woman decided to take a closer look and was horrified to realize it was a human body. She immediately returned home and called the police. Officers arrived at the scene and found the body of a young woman lying in an empty lot near the road. Her tights were pulled down, her dress was lifted, and her shoes were missing. Next to the victim, they discovered a blue towel with red stains resembling blood. Police identified the deceased as 23-year-old Tanya McKinley. A few streets away, they discovered her shoes along with a purse containing an ID in her name. The body was handed over to medical experts while investigators continued to examine the crime scene. It was quickly established that the victim was likely killed elsewhere. There was no blood near her body except for the towel stains, and there were traces on the ground indicating that the body had been dragged from the road towards the roadside. On the towel and the victim's body, police found their first potential leads. There were several human hairs as well as pubic hairs and dog fur. They assumed that the first two samples belonged to the killer, possibly someone with a dog. Medical experts determined that Tanya suffered a blow to the head with a heavy object, but the cause of death was strangulation. They also confirmed that the victim had been sexually assaulted. The experts collected a semen sample from her body, but in those years, DNA analysis had not yet become widely used in forensics. All they could establish was that the suspect had type B blood. Considering that these clues didn't lead detectives to the killer, the investigation continued. They began compiling a list of potential suspects. Their focus initially shifted to Tim, the victim's ex-boyfriend. Speaking with Tanya's relatives and friends, the police learned about the issues in their relationship and constant arguments both before and after the birth of their son. It turned out that when Tanya decided to end the relationship, Tim was against it. He didn't want to part ways with Tanya and continued trying to persuade her. Tim consistently called Tanya, visited her, and behaved as if he couldn't accept the breakup. Investigators considered that on New Year's Eve, Tim might have followed Tanya to the bar, leading to a confrontation that ended in murder. They brought the man in for questioning, but he denied any involvement. Tim also agreed to provide hair samples. Although experts couldn't extract DNA from them, they were able to compare the hairs under a microscope, which would have been sufficient enough to establish similarity. However, Tim's hair significantly differed from those found on the victim's body and the towel. Based on this fact, he was temporarily ruled out as a suspect. After that, detectives turned their attention to everyone who was present at the bar on New Year's Eve. They questioned Vanita about any individuals who might have behaved strangely or aggressively towards Tanya, but she insisted that the evening had passed without any incidents and proceeded very well. The police also discovered that after breaking up with her boyfriend, Tanya briefly dated a man named Kurt. He happened to be the bartender at the same bar where she celebrated the new year, and it was his shift that night. They spoke with Kurt, but he claimed no involvement in the murder. According to him, after finishing his shift, he went to a New Year's party with friends. Investigators interviewed his friends, leading to an intriguing discovery. They confirmed Kurt's presence at the party, but said that he didn't arrive immediately after ending his shift at the bar. Gathering all the testimonies, police concluded that theoretically, Kurt had enough time to commit the crime. Through multiple interviews with individuals from the bar, detectives determined that Tanya was last seen alive at 1:15 a.m. However, no one witnessed her leaving the bar. The police also interviewed residents in the area where the body was found. One family recalled driving by that spot around 2 a.m. and stated they were certain there was no body. Investigators established that Tanya was killed within a little over an hour and a half from the last time she was seen alive, and Kurt didn't have a solid alibi during this specific time frame. He agreed to a polygraph test, and the results were inconclusive, showing deceptive answers to some questions. But the lab experts determined that Kurt's blood type did not match the blood type of the killer, as identified from the semen sample, so the man was eliminated from the list of suspects. Police continued their search for other potential suspects, but their efforts led to dead ends. The analysis of the killer's semen wasn't possible, and they lacked any substantial evidence or witnesses, quickly hitting a dead end in this case. The only thing investigators were nearly certain of was that the perpetrator must have lived in the area where the body was found. This location was secluded from main roads, situated at the edge of an extensive residential area. Police doubted that an unfamiliar perpetrator would go there with the victim's body in a car without any knowledge of the area. Since then, the case remained unsolved for many years. Timothy, who was only 18 months old when his mother died, was raised by his father and Tanya's family. They all decided to shield the child from the truth about what happened to his mother. As he grew older, relatives told him that Tonya had died in a car accident. This continued until he turned 14. With Christmas approaching, the boy grew curious about the gift his father had prepared for him. Timothy decided to search through his father's closet, only to stumble upon something far more chilling than a mere present. He found a letter written by his father addressed to the popular TV host Montel Williams. In the letter, the man asked him to mention the unsolved murder of Tonya, hoping that the publicity would help move the case forward. Timothy read detailed accounts of the murder in the letter, and that's how he learned the true fate of his mother. In the early 2000s, the local police department reopened Tonya's case, hoping that advancements in DNA analysis would help identify the killer. They sent all available evidence to the laboratory for examination. Experts concluded that the blood on the blue towel found near the body did not belong to Tonya, but to an unknown man. They obtained his DNA profile and uploaded it to the FBI database, but there were no matches. The case went cold again until it was reopened in 2015, exactly 30 years after the murder. The killer's DNA still had not appeared in the FBI database, prompting detectives to try a different approach. Modern tools allowed them to search not only for exact matches, but also for partial ones. They considered the possibility that the database might contain relatives of the killer, which could lead them to the suspect. They began to search and eventually narrowed their focus to a specific individual from the FBI database. His DNA shared some patterns with the sample from Tonya's killer, but the resemblance was relatively weak. Police delved into his family background, even reaching out to his relatives who agreed to assist and provided their DNA samples for comparison. After examining the samples, experts reached a disheartening conclusion. They found that this family had no connection to the suspect, leaving the detectives once again with no substantial leads. In 2018, journalist Tony Adam took an interest in this case. Despite not specializing in crime, his personal interest in the subject drew him to the unsolved murder of Tonya. He wanted to help and reached out to the investigators handling the case. Detectives approached his willingness to help with a degree of skepticism. While an experienced journalist, Tony had no background in criminal investigations. However, given the lack of progress in the case, police figured he couldn't make things worse. The journalist joined the investigation and established connections with Tonya's family. They could see his genuine interest in resolving the case and the significant effort he was putting into it. For instance, he worked to garner media coverage for the case, bringing additional attention to it. He also brought a fresh perspective to an investigation that had lingered for over 3 decades. A year later, in 2019, detectives decided to make another attempt to find the killer's relatives. This time, they sought assistance from Parabon, a company specializing in genetic genealogy. In their previous attempt, investigators had only looked for potential relatives through the FBI database, which contained samples from various criminals. However, Parabon examined public genetic databases, which were significantly broader in scope. Anyone could upload their DNA sample to these databases for purposes such as finding relatives or exploring their ancestry. Experts diligently worked through potential relatives of the killer, methodically examining their family trees to identify someone fitting the criteria of their suspect. They sought a man who, in 1985, was old enough to commit the crime and lived in the area. This process took almost a year, presenting an incredibly challenging task for the experts. However, in February 2020, they finally identified a man who theoretically could be the killer. 57-year-old Daniel Wells, who lived in the same city at the time of the murder. Detectives delved into his background and found that Wells had come to the attention of the police several times in the late 80s. He was arrested for assault and later for indecent exposure. As of 2020, Daniel continued to live in Pensacola, working as a carpenter with a wife and children. Detectives needed a sample of Daniel's DNA for a direct comparison with the killer's profile to establish his potential connection to this murder. Due to the absence of any solid evidence, police proceeded cautiously with Daniel, fearing he might flee once he realized he had been identified. They put him under surveillance, and soon the police got an opportunity to obtain his DNA. Daniel threw a cigarette butt out of his car window near his workplace. Investigators seized it and immediately sent it to the lab. Experts extracted DNA from the saliva on the filter and compared it with the killer's DNA from Tanya's case. The result showed a perfect match. 35 years later, the police finally identified the perpetrator, and on the same day, he was arrested. Despite having the results of his DNA analysis, investigators wanted to obtain a confession from Daniel, so they chose to proceed cautiously and refrain from revealing all their evidence at once. They asked patrol officers to pull over the suspect's car under the pretext of a standard ID check. Detectives then approached Daniel and told him that he needed to go to the station with them for further questioning them. They deliberately withheld any additional information, keeping him in suspense during questioning. Investigators slowly directed the conversation towards Tanya's murder, asking about Daniel's whereabouts that night. Initially, he denied ever knowing the woman, and that's when detectives revealed that his DNA was found at the crime scene. Daniel continued to deny everything, but grew increasingly nervous with each question. Detectives emphasized the undebatable nature of the DNA results, leaving him no chance of avoiding consequences. They made it clear that the only way to ease his situation was to confess, and it worked. At some point, Daniel began to speak. Initially, he tried to justify the presence of his DNA by suggesting that he might have had sex with Tanya on that night, but detectives didn't believe this version and continued to demand the truth. Eventually, Daniel confessed to killing Tanya on that New Year's Eve. However, his story raised some serious questions. He admitted to being at the bar where he met Tanya, who mentioned she was looking for a ride home, so Daniel offered to help. According to his story, they went to his house where they drank and engaged in consensual, intimate intercourse. But then an argument erupted between the two, and Daniel claimed he can't remember the cause of it. The situation escalated to the point where Daniel, in a fit of rage, grabbed a heavy wooden cutting board and struck Tanya on the head. Realizing she had died, he panicked. Daniel took her body to the location where it would later be discovered and left it there. On his way back, he disposed of her belongings and returned home. When asked about the dog hairs found on the victim's clothes and towel, he explained that his roommate had a black Labrador, and those hairs were indeed black. Daniel's story sounded like an attempt to minimize his own responsibility. It was hard to believe that Tanya willingly engaged in consensual sex with him, only to have such a severe argument minutes later that led to her death. He also claimed that she died after the blow to the head. However, medical experts had undeniable evidence that the cause of death was strangulation. A more plausible scenario would be that Daniel attempted to assault Tanya and she resisted. He then struck her on the head, but quickly realized she was still alive, leading him to strangle her. Despite the fact that the suspect's confession probably didn't align with the actual events, the detectives had everything they needed. Daniel was arrested on charges of murder and placed in custody. Right after that, investigators contacted Tanya's relatives, including her son, to deliver the long-awaited news. Timothy couldn't hold back his tears and thanked the police for finally finding his mother's killer. However, Daniel wasn't destined to face a judge and serve time for his actions. Just 2 weeks after his arrest, his lifeless body was discovered in his cell. The examination indicated that he had taken his own life. Tonya's relatives were disappointed by the fact that the murderer had escaped the prospect of spending decades behind bars. Nevertheless, in the end, they found some closure in knowing that after 35 long years, the case was finally solved. Today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you, the case of Kirsten Hatfield. A mother put her daughters to bed, but when she went to their room the next morning, one of the girls was missing. The police quickly joined the search, realizing she clearly hadn't left the house of her own accord. Despite uncovering some shocking clues, the search for answers spanned years. Eventually, detectives managed to unravel the truth, and it was truly shocking. Kirsten Hatfield was born on February 12, 1989, in Midwest City, Oklahoma. Kirsten's father left the family right after her birth, leading their mother, Shannon, to move to her parents' house. They helped her raise the child, and when Kirsten turned 2, they moved to their own home. Later, Shannon got married again, and her second daughter, Faith, was born. This marriage also didn't last long, leaving Shannon to raise her daughters alone. Despite her young age, Kirsten helped her mother take care of her younger sister. Thanks to this, she became very independent and got along pretty well with Faith. The girls shared a bedroom while their mother slept in the next one. On the evening of May 13, 1997, when Kirsten was 8 years old and her sister 3, Shannon prepared the girls for sleep. Usually, she reads them a story, but this time, Faith had already fallen asleep, and Kirsten didn't want to wake her. She wished her older daughter a good night and went to her bedroom, leaving the door to the girls' room slightly ajar. She did this every night in case either of the girls woke up and called her. Somewhere around 3 a.m., Shannon was awakened by a noise coming from her daughter's room. Thinking the girls had woken up, she went to their room. However, as soon as she reached the corridor and approached the door to their bedroom, the noise stopped. Assuming the girls had gone back to sleep, she decided not to wake them and was about to return to her room. But before she did, something strange caught her eye. The door to the girls' room was completely closed, although Shannon always left it slightly open. She thought one of the girls might have closed the door, or she herself had forgotten to leave it open. Shannon approached the door, opened it slightly but didn't enter the room, then went back to sleep. The next morning, around 6:30 a.m., Shannon went to wake her children. She entered their bedroom and found that only her younger daughter, Faith, was in bed. She woke Faith up and asked where Kirsten was, but Faith didn't know. Shannon immediately began searching the entire house, but Kirsten was nowhere to be found. She looked outside, then called all of her friends whose Kirsten was friends with. She hoped Kirsten had gone to one of them, but they all said they hadn't seen her. Realizing that Kirsten had disappeared, he told Shannon to call the police and went to their house. So the Shannon called 911, and officers arrived at the scene within a few minutes. Initially, they thought Kirsten might have been hiding somewhere in the house or had gone for a walk. In their quiet town, there had never been a case of a child being abducted from their own bedroom, so the local police had never encountered anything like it. However, soon the officers realized the situation was much more serious. Upon inspecting Kirsten's room, they found the window slightly ajar with a few drops of blood on the frame. The police went outside and began examining the area around the window. A few yards away, they discovered a piece of children's underwear on the ground, stained with blood. The officers asked Shannon to confirm that it belonged to her daughter, and she recognized it. Investigators realized they were likely dealing with a kidnapping, and more officers were immediately called to the scene. When they searched the area behind and around the house, police questioned Kirsten's mother. She recounted waking up at 3 a.m. after hearing a noise. Suddenly, she realized that at that moment, an unknown criminal was likely abducting Kirsten. The search around the house yielded no results, and the police started interviewing all residents in the neighborhood. Unfortunately, none of them saw or heard anything suspicious that night. The only lead detectives could gather was that one of the neighbors was awakened by a dog barking around 3 a.m., coinciding with the time of the abduction. Failing to find any solid leads, investigators turned to a child psychologist to speak with Faith. Despite being only 3 years old, she shared that she had witnessed the abduction. However, she kept repeating only one phrase: "A bad person came and took my sister." This new information once again confirmed that Kirsten did not leave the house willingly, but it provided no further clues to identify the perpetrator or locate Kirsten. Detectives had to restart the investigation practically from scratch. Their initial suspicion leaned towards someone who knew Kirsten well, as it seemed unlikely that a stranger could abduct her from her own room without a sound. Based on the theory, the police uncovered that Kirsten's mother had a history of drug abuse. The detectives explored two possibilities. Either the mother owed money to criminals who abducted her daughter as compensation, or even more disturbingly, the mother voluntarily gave her daughter to the abductors, which would account for the nearly silent kidnapping. They spoke with Shannon, but she denied any involvement. She claimed that she had been rehabilitated from illegal substances for a long time and strongly asserted that she would never give her daughter away. The detectives did not immediately dismiss their suspicions about her, but they were unable to find any evidence that implicated the mother in the case. So, the police decided to seek the public's help, reaching out through the media and asking people to share any information related to the case. In the following days, the police department received hundreds of calls, and detectives diligently followed up on each lead. Most of them were quite superficial and lacked any valuable information. However, investigators soon received an alarming lead. A woman contacted them, expressing her suspicion that her boyfriend was involved in the abduction. She reported that he had been acting aggressively and even threatened her during a heated dispute, claiming that if she didn't comply with his demands, he would subject her to the same fate as Kirsten Hatfield. As the police investigated the suspect further, they discovered a disturbing connection. He knew Shannon's brother, suggesting that Kirsten may have been acquainted with him as well. Additionally, Kristen, Faith, and their mother resided in a house that was once owned by Shannon's brother, indicating that the suspect might have knowledge of the home's layout. The man's background also raised red flags for the police, as he had a history of drug-related offenses and assault charges. All the evidence suggested that he could be linked to the crime. However, the man claimed he was at a bar that night. Police verified this information, and numerous witnesses confirmed his alibi, placing him at the bar until around 4 a.m., eliminating the possibility of him abducting Kirsten. Following this, investigators pursued hundreds of other leads, but all of them led to dead ends. The case stretched over months, and with each passing day, hope of finding Kirsten alive dwindled. Her mother couldn't just wait and do nothing, as the police repeatedly hit dead ends. From the early days, she tried everything in her power to locate her daughter. She gave interviews to the local media, distributed flyers, and even personally investigated various suspects in her quest for the truth. Shannon faced numerous challenges. For instance, she came up with the idea of reaching out to local businesses in the county, asking them to put flyers about Kristen in their offices, stores, and establishments. To her surprise, many refused, citing it contradicted company policies. She also attempted to secure a meeting with the state governor, but it was unsuccessful. Shannon also organized a small center with the goal of attracting volunteers to Kristen's case. They mainly focused on distributing flyers and engaging with the media, but Shannon encountered new problems. Some volunteers stole money, others lied about the work done, and used the media to draw attention to themselves. Despite all of this, she never gave up trying to unravel the truth for many years. Shannon, noticing the fruitless search, changed course. She got a criminology degree and became an officer to find Kristen's kidnapper and shield others from dangerous ex-cons. Convinced the culprit had priors, she meticulously studied local violent offenders for ties to the abduction, but to no avail. At some point, Shannon resigned herself to the likelihood that Kristen was probably no longer alive, and she would never be able to bring her back. Nevertheless, she never abandoned her quest for answers completely. The police occasionally reopened the case, examining new leads, but it yielded no results. In collaboration with the FBI, they even created a sketch of what Kristen might look like. Years after the abduction, no one believed she was still alive. Yet, without her remains, they couldn't declare this with absolute certainty. The stagnation in the case lasted for many years until an unexpected turn of events in 2014. A woman called the police with a rather bizarre story. Her grandmother had recently passed away, and as she sorted through the remaining belongings, she found a diary. In it, the grandmother detailed how her own son had confessed to killing Kirsten Hadfield. The narrative contained such a wealth of details that detectives had no doubt about the authenticity of the information. According to the diary, the man abducted Kirsten from her bedroom and took her to a nearby town where he owned a house. There, he subjected her to heinous acts and brutally murdered her. The description of the entire process spanned several pages, leaving even seasoned investigators horrified. Furthermore, the diary mentioned that the entire progress was recorded on video cassette. Detectives immediately brought in him for questioning. While they anticipated him denying everything, his words surprised them even more. He claimed no involvement in the crime, but knew who committed it because Kirsten was killed in his ex-girlfriend's house. This perplexed the police, prompting them to ask the man for the address of this house. Detectives swiftly obtained a warrant and sent in a team to thoroughly examine the property. Their first step involved spraying luminol, a substance that emits a glow upon contact with even the tiniest traces of blood, even if it had been cleaned from the scene of the crime. When the forensic experts did this, they were met with genuine shock. One of them later stated that the entire house lit up like a Christmas tree. The chemical revealed that blood was practically everywhere, and most importantly, the blood stain patterns matched the gruesome details of the murder described in the diary. Experts removed floorboards, cut out sections of wallpaper, and sent everything to the lab. They also assembled a team for excavations on the property, hoping to find Kirsten's body. In addition, the police found a box in the house containing hundreds of video cassettes, prompting them to recall the diary. They knew that one of these tapes should contain footage of the victim being abused. Detectives meticulously reviewed each tape, a process that took countless hours. However, none of the cassettes contained anything relating to the murder. The excavations also yielded no results. There were no remains or any evidence in the soil on the property. But then the detectives faced the most unexpected twist. Experts analyzing the remains of the bloodstains in the house concluded that the blood belonged to an animal, not a human. This came as an absolute shock to the police, as they were convinced they were finally on the verge of solving Kirsten's case. Instead, investigators faced yet another false lead. What this was exactly remains unknown. Perhaps someone decided to play a cruel joke on the police, or the diary was penned by an individual with mental health issues who saw information about Kirsten's abduction on the news and believed in a narrative born in their mind. Nevertheless, detectives continued to hope that sooner or later they would uncover the truth. However, no new leads emerged, and the case once again came to a standstill. In the summer of 2015, Kirsten's case was handed over to a new detective named Daryl Miller, who decided to initiate a fresh investigation. He studied all the existing documents and records, and at some point, he noticed something peculiar. To his surprise, Miller realized that over all these years, his predecessors hadn't examined the crucial pieces of evidence: the blood on the windowsill in the victim's room and on her underwear. Although these pieces of evidence were stored in the warehouse, for some inexplicable reason, they hadn't been sent to the lab for analysis. Perhaps back then, the police thought the blood belonged to Kirsten, and analyzing it wouldn't yield any results. Miller decided to rectify this and sent the evidence to the lab. Soon they called him back, stating that both blood samples belonged not to Kirsten, but to an unknown male. This was a long-awaited breakthrough, but the detective faced a new challenge. The abductor's DNA sample was immediately uploaded to the FBI database, but there was no match. This could mean that he hadn't committed serious crimes, or it happened before the database's creation. Nevertheless, Miller was undeterred. He decided to collect DNA samples from all the men involved in the case since the abduction. The police compiled a list, located each person, and sent their DNA to the lab. Surprisingly, every individual willingly provided their samples right away. This discovery led investigators to consider that the murderer might not have been part of the case files. Despite this, Miller patiently awaited the results until he finally received a call from the lab. Experts had completed the analysis of one of the samples and found that it perfectly matched the blood found on the victim's windowsill and underwear. The individual was 56-year-old Anthony Palma, a neighbor of the Hatfield family who lived just across the street from them. Palma was one of the first people the police spoke to on the day of the abduction. Back then, he told them he woke up around 3 a.m. due to his dog barking. Now, with confirmation of his involvement, detectives decided to speak with him again. While DNA evidence was more than sufficient for a conviction in court, investigators hoped to extract a confession. Firstly, it would significantly expedite the trial, and secondly, only he knew where Kirsten's body was, making it nearly impossible to locate her remains without his cooperation. Detectives chose to proceed cautiously. They invited Anthony for questioning, stating it was a routine process. Supposedly, they were re-interviewing everyone, including neighbors, hoping to gather some new information. In reality, they had a specific task: to get him to admit whether he had ever been inside the Hatfield family home. Initially, detectives asked if he remembered anything else from that night. Anthony recounted the same story as 18 years ago. However, this time he added a new detail. He allegedly saw a white car parked in front of Kirsten's house, but didn't think much of it. Next, the police inquired about his familiarity with Kirsten and her family. Anthony said he knew them as neighbors, but never interacted with Kirsten personally. He added that during those years, he got along well with other neighborhood kids. For instance, they occasionally asked him to fix their bikes or stop by for candy. Subsequently, the police asked if he had ever been inside Kirsten's house. Perhaps Kirsten's mother had asked him for help, or he had visited just to chat. However, Anthony claimed he had never been inside the house while the family lived there. For the detectives, this became a crucial moment for the interrogation. Considering the man's blood was found on the windowsill from the victim's room, they had just caught him in a lie. Thanks to this, in court, he wouldn't be able to claim that the blood got there under different circumstances, like when he visited the neighbors on another day. However, there was a problem. The house where Kirsten lived had previously belonged to Anthony's friend, and he admitted to visiting it during those years. But the blood sample on the windowsill was clearly fresh and couldn't have been left there many years ago. Nevertheless, detectives decided to move on to the main part and informed him that his blood was found in Kirsten's room and on her underwear. Anthony began denying this, repeating that he had never been inside their home. Investigators tried to extract a confession, but he consistently stuck to his denial. Then they opted to change tactics and left the room. Detective Miller entered to speak with Anthony. He brought along a photo of Kirsten, placing it on the table in front of the suspect. Anthony immediately pushed it away and avoided looking at the photo for the rest of the conversation. Miller bombarded him with a barrage of questions, anticipating that Anthony would inadvertently contradict himself, but he steadfastly maintained his innocence. Following this, they obtained a search warrant for his house and thoroughly excavated the entire area, but couldn't find any trace of Kirsten's remains or any other evidence. During the trial, Anthony persisted in denying his involvement, but the results of the DNA analysis spoke for themselves. In court, additional details emerged that police had overlooked during the initial investigation. it turned out Anthony had prior run-ins with the law. Several years before Kirsten's abduction, he had intruded into another girl's bedroom and assaulted her. He had also been imprisoned in the 80s for a weapon-related attack. This further underscored Anthony's status as a dangerous criminal, but for some reason, his past convictions were overlooked in 1997. In late 2017, a jury convicted Anthony of abducting and murdering Kirsten, handing down a life sentence. Despite the guilty verdict, Anthony refused to disclose the location of Kirsten's body throughout the trial, and police believe they may never recover her remains. The challenge stems from Anthony's job with the Park Services, which gave him knowledge of remote areas where he could have buried the body, making it nearly impossible for investigators to find. However, Kirsten's mother never gave up on trying to locate her daughter. She persistently called Anthony and visited him in prison, spending countless hours attempting to elicit information. With each encounter, she felt Anthony was on the verge of revealing the whereabouts of the body, but he never followed through. In early 2019, Anthony was killed by his cellmate, driven by personal animosity stemming from Anthony's crime against a child. As a result, the Kirsten family's sole hope to locate Kirsten's body rests on the chance that hunters or travelers may stumble upon it in remote national parks.